I think about paper sometimes, not the bright white sheets that come from printers or the pages of mass-produced books, but the idea of paper itself, the notion that human beings, across centuries and continents, found ways to capture thought, to hold language, to preserve what mattered most. There's something almost miraculous in it, this transformation of plant fiber into surface, of organic matter into canvas for the mind. And when I let my thoughts wander back through time, I find myself standing at the edge of the Nile, where the water moves slowly, thick with silt, and the reeds grow tall in the shallows. The papyrus plants rise from the riverbank, their triangular stems reaching upward, swaying slightly, and I watch as practiced hands, cut the stalks near the base, selecting the tallest ones, the strongest, bringing them to shore where the work begins. The outer rind peels away easily, revealing the pale pith inside, and this inner core, fibrous and damp, holds everything. This is where the magic lives, in the cellular structure of a marsh plant, in the natural adhesives locked inside its tissues. Someone slices the pith into thin strips, laying them side by side on a flat stone, each strip pressed against the next, forming a horizontal layer, and then another layer crosses over it perpendicular, creating a woven pattern without any weaving, just plant against plant, fiber against fiber. And here's where understanding deepens, because papyrus doesn't need glue, the plant's own sugars, its natural resins. They seep out under pressure, binding the layers together as the water evaporates, as the strips dry slowly in the Egyptian sun. Days of drying, days of waiting, while the fibers interlock and the surface becomes smooth. I imagine running my hands across that finished sheet, feeling the slight texture, the parallel lines where the strips meet, and there's a warmth to it, a subtle variation in color, cream and ivory and pale gold, because this is organic. This is river plant, turned into something that will outlast empires. The smell must have been earthy, vegetal, like wet grass drying in summer heat. And perhaps there was a faint sweetness too, from those natural sugars activating, binding, creating something new from something that grew. Scribes would prepare their surfaces carefully, burnishing the papyrus with smooth stones, polishing it until the fibers lay flat and even, until the surface could accept ink without bleeding, without the characters spreading and blurring into illegibility. And they wrote, century after century, in hieratic script and demotic, recording temple inventories and love poems, legal contracts and sacred hymns, each stroke of the reed brush landing on a surface that came from the delta, from the marshlands where ibises waded and lotus flowers opened at dawn. But papyrus had its limitations, its geography. It grew where the Nile flooded, where the water table stayed high. It was a gift of that particular ecosystem, and beyond Egypt's borders, beyond the Mediterranean coasts where papyrus could be traded, other minds were solving the same problem differently, across deserts and mountain ranges, in the river valleys of another ancient world. Hands were stripping bark from mulberry trees, from the paper mulberry, the kozo, and discovering that beneath the rough outer bark lay something softer, a bast fiber, pale and surprisingly strong. The inner bark came away in long strips, and when soaked in water, when beaten and pulped, the fibers began to separate, to break down into something almost cloud-like, a suspension of cellulose in water. And this This was the moment of transformation, because unlike papyrus, which stayed whole, these fibers were disintegrating, becoming individual threads floating in liquid. I think of those early paper makers watching the water turn milky with fiber, understanding somehow, through observation and experiment, that they could capture this suspension, lift it, strain it through a screen. The screen itself, bamboo strips bound together, or cloth stretched over a wooden frame, dipped into the vat, and as it lifted, as the water drained away, the fibers caught on the screen's surface, interlacing, forming a mat, a web of cellulose that would dry into something entirely new. This wasn't strips laid side by side. This was fiber bonded to fiber at the molecular level. Hydrogen bonds forming between cellulose chains, creating a sheet that was uniform, strong, flexible in ways that papyrus could never be. And the texture, I imagine it was softer, more consistent, without those visible strips, just a gentle surface that took ink beautifully, that could be folded without cracking, that could travel without shattering into fragments. The knowledge of paper making, this understanding of how to transform plant fiber into writing surface, it didn't spread quickly, not in the way information moves now. Instead, it traveled along trade routes, carried by those who had seen the process, who understood the subtle chemistry of fiber and water. In China, where this technique first emerged, perhaps as early as the 2nd century, or even before, the methods were guarded, valued, because paper represented something revolutionary, a surface cheaper than silk, more flexible than bamboo strips, lighter than the wooden tablets that scholars had used for generations. I think of a Kai Lun, whose name appears in the historical record around the year 105, a court official during the Han Dynasty, and whether he invented paper or simply improved and standardized existing techniques, his legacy became intertwined with this material, with the idea that tree bark and hemp, old fishing nets and rags, could be transformed into something precious. The process he refined, or perhaps documented, began with collection, gathering the raw materials, the inner bark of mulberry trees. Yes, but also hemp fibers, remnants of cloth too worn for other purposes, and these materials were sorted, examined, chosen for their fiber length and strength. Then came the soaking, immersing everything in water, letting it soften, days of softening, until the fibers began to separate, and then the beating, rhythmic and constant, using wooden mallets or stones, pounding the wet fibers against flat surfaces, breaking down the cellular structure, releasing the individual threads of cellulose. The sound of it, that repetitive thudding, it must have echoed through workshops, a meditation in percussion, and slowly, gradually, the mass transformed into pulp, into a substance that was neither quite solid nor quite liquid, something in between. And here's where the art revealed itself, because the quality of paper depended on this stage, on how thoroughly the fibers were beaten, how evenly they were distributed. Too little beating, and the fibers wouldn't bond; too much, and they would become too short, too weak. The papermaker developed a feel for it, knowing by touch and sight when the pulp was ready, when it had reached that perfect consistency, and then it went into the vat, diluted with more water, stirred gently, creating a suspension where thousands of tiny fibers floated, waiting. The mold came next, and this tool, This simple frame with its screen surface, it held everything, the future of the sheet. The papermaker dipped it into the vat, submerging it completely, then lifted it horizontally, slowly, watching as the water drained through the screen, as the fibers settled onto the surface. And there was a technique to it, a slight shake, a gentle back and forth motion that helped the fibers interlock, that created a uniform distribution across the screen, because without this movement, the paper would be thick in some places, thin in others, weak and uneven. The water dripped away, and what remained was a wet mat of fiber, fragile still, barely holding together, and the papermaker had to transfer this, lift it somehow, press it onto a felt cloth or smooth board, and this required steady hands, confidence, because one wrong move and the wet sheet would tear, would collapse back into formless pulp, stack upon stack, wet sheets separated by felts, and then the pressing weights placed on top, or a screw press if the workshop had one, squeezing out more water, compressing the fibers even closer together, and those hydrogen bonds, those molecular attractions between cellulose chains, they began to form, creating strength, creating paper. After pressing came drying, and this too required patience, hanging the sheets or laying them on heated surfaces, watching as the remaining moisture evaporated, as the fibers contracted slightly, tightening their grip on one another, and the paper that emerged was pale, almost luminous, with a subtle texture from the screen pattern pressed into its surface. The Chinese paper makers experimented, naturally, because human curiosity demands it. They tried different plant fibers, bamboo, rice straw, the bark of different trees, and each material brought its own qualities. Bamboo created a harder paper, more resistant to insects, while certain tree barks produced softer, more absorbent sheets. They added sizing too, coating the paper with starch or animal gelatin, creating a barrier that prevented ink from spreading, from feathering across the surface, and this treatment transformed paper from merely possible to truly practical. Because what good is a writing surface if the characters blur and run? The earliest papers were precious, used for important documents, official records, imperial decrees. But as production increased, as more workshops learned the techniques, paper became more available. Scholars could afford it. Artists could experiment with it, and Chinese culture, with its reverence for calligraphy and painting, found in paper the perfect medium. By the 3rd and 4th centuries, papermaking had become refined, sophisticated, different regions developing their own specialties, their own secret techniques passed from master to apprentice, and the knowledge began to leak outward, traveling along the Silk Road, carried by merchants and monks, by prisoners of war who had worked in paper workshops. Korea received the knowledge early, perhaps by the 4th century, and Korean papermakers took the techniques and adapted them, using their own local fibers, creating papers that were remarkably strong, that could last for centuries. Papers made from mulberry bark, processed with such care that the finished sheets had an almost silken quality. Japan learned from Korea, and this transmission, probably in the 6th or 7th century, sparked another evolution, because the Japanese, with their aesthetic sensibility, their attention to subtle beauty, they approached papermaking as an art form, not merely a craft. The washi tradition emerged using kozo, gampi, mitsumata, different plant fibers that each brought distinct characteristics. And the Japanese papermakers developed techniques of extraordinary refinement, creating papers so thin they seemed almost transparent, or papers thick and strong enough to be used in architecture, in screens and sliding doors. But I'm moving too quickly, because back in the heartland, in China during the Tang Dynasty, in the 7th and 8th centuries, paper had become commonplace enough that it was used for everything, for printing, for wrapping, for making money, actual currency printed on paper, a concept that seemed almost magical, that something so light could hold value. The woodblock printing revolution depended entirely on paper, because you needed a surface that could receive ink evenly, that could be pressed against carved blocks without tearing, and paper, with its uniform surface and its strength, it made possible the reproduction of Buddhist sutras, the spread of knowledge beyond the monastery walls, and still the knowledge moved westward, reaching Samarkand, that crossroads city where cultures collided and traded, and here, around the year 750, according to legend, Chinese papermakers were captured during a battle, brought to this Central Asian city, and forced to share their techniques. Whether the story is precisely true or not, papermaking did take root in Samarkand, and from there it spread into the Islamic world, carried by scholars and artisans who recognized its value, who saw that paper could preserve the Quran, could facilitate the explosion of learning that characterized the Islamic Golden Age. The Islamic papermakers adapted the Chinese techniques to their own materials, using linen rags primarily, because these were available in abundance, and linen fibers, long and strong, produced excellent paper, smooth and white, perfect for the flowing Arabic script, for the geometric patterns of Islamic art. Baghdad became a center of paper-making by the 8th century, and the paper produced there was famous for its quality, its durability, and as Islam spread, so did the knowledge of paper, to Damascus, to Cairo, to Morocco, each region establishing its own workshops, its own traditions. In medieval Spain, in cities like Toledo and Valencia, under Moorish rule, paper-making flourished, and this is where Europe finally encountered the technique, because the Christian kingdoms, watching from the north, they saw something valuable, something that could transform their own limited writing culture. But Europe, conservative in its traditions, resistant to change, Europe clung to parchment, to vellum, those surfaces made from animal skin, and there were good reasons for this resistance. Parchment was familiar, trusted. It lasted centuries if properly stored. It had the weight and feel of permanence. Parchment making was its own ancient craft, stretching back to Pergamum, that Greek city from which the name derived, and the process was entirely different from paper, starting not with plants but with animals, with sheep and goats and calves, whose skins, after slaughter, became raw material. The skins were soaked in lime, a caustic bath that loosened the hair, made it easy to scrape away, and then more scraping, removing every trace of flesh, of fat, of the membrane that had once held muscle to skin. And this work was hard, physical, requiring strength and precision. Stretched on frames, the wet skins were pulled taut, dried under tension, and as they dried they became translucent in places, creamy white or pale yellow, and the surface was scraped again, smoothed with pumice, until it achieved that characteristic velvety texture, until it could accept ink without the characters spreading. The finest parchment, called vellum, came from calf skin, and this material was extraordinarily expensive because you could only get so much writing surface from one animal, and a single illuminated manuscript, a Bible or a book of hours, might require the skins of dozens, even hundreds, of animals. So European monasteries, with their scriptoria, their copying rooms where monks labored over manuscripts, they had vast investments in parchment, in the suppliers who provided it, in the techniques of working with it, and paper, this foreign material from the East. It seemed suspect, fragile, impermanent. But gradually, through the 13th and 14th centuries, paper began to establish itself in Europe, first in Italy, where merchants trading with the Islamic world understood its practicality, its economy, and the first Italian paper mills appeared, driven by water wheels, powered by rivers flowing down from the Alps. These mills represented an innovation, a mechanization of what had been entirely hand labor, because the beating of rags into pulp, that exhausting rhythmic pounding, it could be done by wooden hammers lifted and dropped by water power, and the sound of these stampers rising and falling, crashing down on wet rags, it echoed through valleys, a constant percussion that marked the presence of a paper mill. The Italian paper makers used linen rags, cotton rags, anything made from plant fiber that had already been processed into thread, into cloth. And these textiles, worn out from years of use, they were collected by rag merchants, sorted by quality, sold to the mills where they began their second life. White rags produced white paper, naturally, while colored fabrics created tinted sheets, and the paper makers learned to sort carefully, to separate the finest linens from the coarser materials, because quality control began here, at the very beginning, with the selection of raw materials. The rags were chopped into smaller pieces, fed into the stamping mills, where those massive wooden hammers, studded sometimes with nails or metal points, they pounded the fabric hour after hour, day after day, breaking down the weave, separating the individual fibers, reducing everything to pulp. Water flowed constantly through the process, washing, diluting, carrying away impurities, and the consistency had to be monitored, adjusted, because too thick and the paper would be uneven, too thin and it would be weak, transparent, unsuitable for writing. The vat man, that was his title, his role in the workshop. He stood at the large wooden vat filled with diluted pulp, and his skill determined everything, the quality of each sheet, the thickness, the uniformity, because his hands controlled the mold. His movements created the paper. He dipped the mold, that rectangular frame with its wire screen, into the vat, submerging it at just the right angle, and then lifted it horizontally with a practiced shake, a subtle motion that distributed the fibers evenly across the screen, and the water drained through, leaving behind a thin layer of interlaced fibers. The shake was everything. Too gentle, and the fibers would settle unevenly. Too vigorous, and they would wash off the screen entirely. And this knowledge came only through experience, through making sheet after sheet, thousands of sheets, until the motion became automatic, instinctive. And there was beauty in watching it, the way the wet fibers caught the light, the way they transformed from liquid suspension to solid sheet in just seconds. And each mold left its mark, the pattern of the wire screen, the laid lines running one direction, the chain lines crossing perpendicular, pressed into the paper's surface like a fingerprint, like proof of its handmade origin. The coucher, the second worker, he received each wet sheet, carefully transferring it from the mold to a piece of felt. And this required perfect timing, perfect coordination between the two workers, because the vatman was already dipping again, creating the next sheet, and the rhythm couldn't break, couldn't pause. Stack after stack accumulated, wet paper alternating with felt, and when enough sheets had been made, maybe 100, maybe more, the stack went into the press, a massive screw press, and slowly, with tremendous force, the water was squeezed out, the fibers compressed, and those molecular bonds, those hydrogen connections between cellulose chains, they locked the fibers together, creating strength, creating permanence. After pressing, the sheets were separated from the felts carefully because they were still damp, still fragile, and hung to dry, draped over ropes or wooden poles in airy lofts. And the drying time depended on humidity, on temperature, on air circulation, days or even weeks sometimes, waiting for the moisture to evaporate completely. But even dry, the paper wasn't finished, because unsized paper without treatment, it absorbed ink like a sponge. The characters would blur, spread, become illegible. And so the sheets were sized, dipped into a solution of animal gelatin, rendered from scraps of parchment, from bones and hides, creating a protein coating that sealed the surface, that made the paper hold ink cleanly. After sizing came more drying, more waiting, and then the final step, the burnishing, rubbing the surface with smooth stones, polishing it until it achieved a slight sheen, until it was ready to receive writing, to become the vessel for human thought. And each mill developed its reputation, its specialty. Some produced thick papers for ledgers and legal documents. Others made thin sheets for correspondence, and they marked their papers with watermarks, designs created by shaping wire and sewing it to the mold, so that where the wire design sat, less fiber accumulated, creating a translucent image visible when the paper was held to light. These watermarks became signatures, proof of origin. A bull's head might indicate one mill, an anchor another, and collectors today can date old papers, trace their origins, just by examining these ghostly images embedded in the fiber itself. France developed its own paper-making tradition, particularly in the Champagne region, near Troyes, where clear streams provided power and water, and French papers became known for their quality, their consistency, competing with Italian production for the European market. The Netherlands, too, with its advanced hydraulic engineering, its understanding of water management. The Dutch established mills that produced papers in tremendous quantities, and Dutch paper became standard for many purposes, for printing especially, as books multiplied and literacy spread. Germany, England, Spain, each country established its paper industry. Each adapted the techniques to local conditions, local materials, and slowly, inexorably, paper displaced parchment, not because parchment was inferior, but because paper was cheaper, faster to produce, more available. A scribe in the 15th century working on parchment, he might complete a few pages in a day, cutting his quills, mixing his inks, working with precious material that couldn't be wasted. But that same scribe with paper, he could be more experimental, more free, because mistakes were less costly, because paper, while still valuable, wasn't prohibitively expensive. And then came printing, Gutenberg's revolution, movable type, and suddenly the demand for paper exploded, because books, thousands of copies of a single text, they required thousands of sheets, and only paper could meet this demand. Only paper was abundant enough, affordable enough, uniform enough. The printing press and paper, they were partners, co-creators of a revolution in knowledge, and European paper mills expanded, mechanized further, sought efficiencies, because the appetite for printed material seemed insatiable. But even as paper became common, even as it transformed European culture, enabled the Reformation, facilitated the scientific revolution, carried news and ideas across continents, the basic process remained remarkably similar to what Chinese papermakers had developed more than 1,000 years earlier. Rags into pulp, pulp onto screens, pressing, drying, sizing, the fundamental chemistry of cellulose fiber, the physics of hydrogen bonding. These didn't change, couldn't change, because they were inherent to the material itself, to what paper was and is. Each sheet, whether made in 18th century France or 10th century China, it represented the same miracle. Plant fiber reorganized, transformed from its original purpose, no longer part of a living organism, no longer fabric, but something new, a surface that could hold marks, preserve symbols, carry meaning across time, and the texture varied, naturally, depending on the skill of the maker, the quality of the materials. Italian papers might be smoother, more refined, while rougher provincial papers showed more variation, more character, the individual fibers visible if you looked closely, if you ran your fingers across the surface. The smell of paper mills, that must have been distinctive, the sour tang of fermenting rags, the wet wool scent of felts constantly damp, the sizing vats with their animal gelatin, and underlying everything, the clean smell of cellulose, of plant fiber, earthy and slightly sweet. In the sizing room, where sheets were dipped in heated gelatin, the air would be humid, warm, and the smell more intense, almost meaty, because this was animal protein, rendered connective tissue, and it created a surface that transformed the paper's relationship with ink, made writing possible, made permanence achievable. The finished papers, when held to the nose, they carried a subtle scent, not unpleasant, a hint of the gelatin perhaps, the clean smell of dried fiber, and papers aged, their scent changing, becoming drier, dustier, that characteristic smell of old books, of archives, of libraries, where centuries of paper breathed together in climate-controlled silence. Different fibers created different papers. Linen produced strong sheets with a slight sheen. Cotton made softer paper, more absorbent, and papermakers became expert at judging, at feeling a rag between their fingers and knowing what kind of paper it would yield, what characteristics it would bring. The workshops developed hierarchies, gradations of quality, with first-rate papers reserved for important documents, for fine printing, for art, and lesser grades used for wrapping, for everyday correspondence, for purposes where longevity didn't matter as much. And papermakers guarded their techniques, their specific methods, the exact timing of their processes, because in a competitive market, quality meant reputation, reputation meant survival, and a master papermaker's knowledge accumulated over decades that was valuable, not worth protecting. Apprentices learned slowly, over years, watching and assisting, gradually being trusted with more responsibility, moving from preparation of materials to the actual making and the final skill. The vatman's art, that came last, because it required not just technique, but judgment, sensitivity, an almost intuitive understanding of how the pulp would behave. The seasons affected everything. Winter meant slower drying, colder water that changed how fibers suspended. Summer brought faster production, but also the risk of pulp souring, fermenting in the vats, and mills adjusted their rhythms accordingly, working with nature rather than fighting against it. In some regions, particularly in Asia, papermakers added other substances to the pulp: rice, starch, plant mucilages, materials that helped the fibers bond, that added sizing properties directly into the sheet rather than applying them afterward. And these additions created papers with distinct characteristics, different feels, different behaviors. With ink, Japanese papermakers, pursuing their aesthetic vision, they developed techniques of extraordinary subtlety, adding delicate fibers, flower petals sometimes, creating papers that were art objects in themselves. And the Naga Shizuki method, their particular approach to sheet formation, it involved a different motion, a more complex interaction with the pulp, allowing for the creation of papers impossibly thin, yet remarkably strong. The fibers in Japanese paper, especially kozo, they were longer than those in European papers, and this length created strength, allowed the paper to be pulled thin without tearing, and when held to light, these papers seemed almost luminous, translucent, but not transparent, glowing with an inner quality, Korean hanji, made with such care that single sheets could last a millennium. Papermakers there developed techniques of repeated beating, of careful processing that preserved fiber length while creating thorough bonding, and hanji could be twisted, folded, used in ways that would destroy ordinary paper. But in Europe, as the 18th century progressed, as industrialization began to transform every craft, papermakers faced new pressures, demands for greater quantity, faster production, lower costs, and the traditional methods, beautiful as they were, couldn't scale to meet the appetite of an increasingly literate population. The first innovations were mechanical, better stampers, more efficient presses, but the fundamental bottleneck remained, the vatman and his mold, because each sheet required individual attention, individual formation, and there was only so fast a human being could work, even a skilled one, and the raw materials too. They were becoming scarce because rags, the foundation of European papermaking, they depended on textile production, on worn-out clothing and linens, and the supply couldn't expand quickly enough, couldn't keep pace with demand. Papermakers began experimenting, searching for alternatives. Could you make paper from wood directly, from a straw, from other plant materials that were more abundant than rags? And these experiments were largely unsuccessful at first. They pointed toward a future transformation, though that future was still decades away. The color of paper, this too was evolving, because earlier papers often had a cream or ivory tone. the natural color of aged linen, of cotton. But as bleaching techniques improved, as paper makers learned to use chlorine, papers became whiter, brighter, and this whiteness became associated with quality, with purity, though some papers were deliberately colored. Blue papers, gray papers, created by adding dyes to the pulp. And these colored sheets served specific purposes: decorative end papers for books, specialty items, papers that announced their purpose through their tint. The texture of the paper surface, this varied with the mold. Wove. Paper came from molds with a very fine wire cloth screen, creating a surface without the prominent laid and chain lines, smoother, more uniform, and wove paper became preferred for certain kinds of printing, for illustrations especially, where fine detail mattered. Laid paper, with its distinctive line pattern, it remained standard for many purposes, for writing papers particularly, because the texture provided a subtle resistance, a feedback under the pen, and some writers preferred this, found the slight texture helped control the flow of ink. The watermarks grew more elaborate, becoming not just mill marks but decorative elements, images of animals, crests, initials, and the skill of the watermark maker, bending and soldering fine wire into intricate designs. This became its own specialty, its own craft within the craft. Holding an old piece of paper to the light, examining its watermark, you could read history, trace trade routes, identify the mill where it was made, perhaps even the year, because many marks included dates, and this embedded information, invisible except in transmitted light. It fascinates still, this secret writing in the paper itself, the feel of handmade paper. Even now, it's distinctive. There's a slight irregularity, a decal edge where the pulp seeped under the mold's frame, creating a feathered border, and this imperfection, this evidence of the hand, it became valued, treasured, proof that the paper was made with care, with attention. By the 19th century, the transformation accelerated, the Industrial Revolution bringing new machinery, new possibilities, and the Fourdrinier machine, invented in the early 1800s, it mechanized sheet formation, creating continuous webs of paper, endless rolls rather than individual sheets. The machine used a moving screen, a wire mesh belt, and pulp was poured onto this moving surface, water draining as it traveled, and the paper formed continuously, passing through presses, overheated rollers, emerging dry at the other end. And the speed, the quantity, it was revolutionary, transformative. But something was lost too, because machine-made paper, uniform and efficient as it was, it lacked the subtle variations, the character of handmade sheets, the fibers all aligned in one direction from the machine's motion, creating papers that tore easily along that grain, that behaved differently than the random fiber orientation of hand-formed sheets. And as wood pulp processes were perfected, as paper makers learned to break down wood fibers chemically, dissolving the lignin that made wood rigid, papers became even cheaper, more abundant, but also less stable, because wood pulp papers, especially those made with mechanical processes that left lignin in, they yellowed, became brittle, degraded in ways that rag papers never did. The great libraries, preserving books from the 19th century, they face this crisis still, because books printed on wood pulp paper, they're crumbling, acidifying, destroying themselves from within, while books from earlier centuries, printed on rag paper, they remain supple, readable, preserved by the chemistry of their materials, yet the abundance that industrial papermaking created, it enabled things impossible before, newspapers reaching millions, books becoming affordable to ordinary people, universal education requiring millions upon millions of sheets for students' notebooks and textbooks, and perhaps the trade was necessary, longevity for accessibility, permanence for democracy. The craft tradition continued, though, in smaller workshops, in studios where artists needed particular papers, handmade papers for watercolors, for printmaking, for calligraphy. And these artisan papermakers, they kept the old knowledge alive, adapted it, experimented with new fibers, new techniques, creating papers that were works of art themselves. In Japan, the Mingei movement, the celebration of folk crafts, it helped preserve traditional papermaking, recognizing washi as a cultural treasure, and papermakers continued working by hand, using methods passed down through generations, creating papers for shoji screens, for origami, for the restoration of ancient texts, the smell of a traditional paper workshop. Even today, it carries echoes of the past, wet fiber, clean and vegetal, the sizing vats, if animal gelatin is still used, or the newer synthetic sizes with their chemical tang, and always underlying everything, that fundamental scent of cellulose, of plant material transformed. Running your hands across different papers, you can feel the history. Rough handmade sheets with their irregular surface, smooth machine-made papers, the crisp snap of sized paper versus the soft absorbency of unsized. And each texture tells a story about how it was made, what it was meant for, who valued it enough to create it. The transition from parchment to paper, it took centuries in Europe, and parchment never entirely disappeared. It remained the choice for certain documents, diplomas, legal instruments, anything requiring the weight of permanence, the gravitas of tradition. But paper won, ultimately, not because it was better in every way, but because it was good enough and abundant and cheap enough that knowledge could spread, that ordinary people could own books, could write letters, could participate in the world of written communication that had once been reserved for elites. And yet, in that victory, in that abundance, something subtle shifted. Because when writing materials are scarce, expensive, every word carries weight, requires consideration, but when paper is cheap, readily available, the relationship changes. Writing becomes more casual, more disposable, and perhaps we lost some reverence, some sense of the precious. Still, holding a piece of fine paper, really noticing it, feeling its weight, its texture, seeing how it takes ink, how light passes through it. There's something there, a connection to all those centuries of human ingenuity, all those hands that learned to transform plant into surface, fiber into possibility, the chemistry of it, the molecular dance that happens when cellulose fibers bond. It's the same whether the paper maker works in ancient China or medieval Italy or modern Japan, because chemistry doesn't change, doesn't respect culture or time. The hydroxyl groups on cellulose molecules, they reach out, form hydrogen bonds with neighboring molecules. And this network of attractions, billions upon billions of tiny connections, they create the strength we call paper. And there's something profound in that, in the universality of it, that human beings in completely separate civilizations with no contact, no shared knowledge, they all discovered this same transformation, all learned to break down plant fiber and reconstitute it, all found their way to paper or something very like it. Perhaps it speaks to necessity, to the deep human need to preserve thought, to send messages across distance and time. And when that need is strong enough, minds turn toward solutions, experiment, observe, learn from failure, and eventually, independently, arrive at similar answers. The sensory memory of paper, it must be among the most common human experiences. The rustle of turning pages, the slight resistance of a pen moving across a textured surface. The way paper smells differently when it's new versus old, fresh versus damp. The visual pleasure of cream-colored laid paper versus bright white wove. Children learning to write. They develop relationships with paper. The wide-ruled notebook paper of early grades. The way crayon feels different than pencil. How markers sometimes bleed through. And these tactile lessons, they're learning about absorbency, about sizing, about fiber structure, without knowing the words, just through direct experience. Artists choose their papers with extraordinary care because the surface determines everything. Watercolor paper must absorb pigment while holding its shape when wet. Printmaking papers need to withstand pressure, to capture fine detail from an etched plate, and the wrong paper, it can ruin the work, while the right paper elevates it, becomes an integral part of the art itself. The Japanese concept of kami, the word means both paper and spirit, and while this may be linguistic coincidence, there's poetry in it, in the idea that paper holds something essential, something beyond mere utility, that it's worthy of reverence, of careful attention. In traditional bookbinding, the choice of paper matters not just for the text pages, but for the end papers, the marbled sheets that line the covers, the tissue protecting illustrations, and a fine binding uses different papers for different purposes, each selected for its specific qualities, its role in the whole. The watermarks, those ghostly images, they remind us that paper is translucent, that light passes through it, and this quality, this semi-transparency, it's part of what makes paper feel alive somehow, because it interacts with light, changes appearance depending on how it's lit, whether you're looking at it or through it. Holding very old paper. Paper from the 17th or 18th century, there's often a suppleness to it, a flexibility that seems surprising given its age, because good rag paper, properly made and stored, it doesn't become brittle. The long fibers retain their strength, their ability to bend without breaking, and this longevity, it wasn't planned exactly, but it emerged from the materials, from the methods, from the chemistry of cellulose and the physics of fiber. The evolution of paper, from precious to common, it parallels other technologies, other materials that began rare and expensive and gradually became everyday. But paper's journey seems particularly important, particularly transformative, because it democratized knowledge, made literacy possible for masses of people, enabled revolutions both political and intellectual. Yet handmade paper persists, not as a primary technology, but as an art, a craft, a connection to slower ways of making, and people still learn the process, still set up vats and molds in workshops and studios, still find satisfaction in the direct engagement in transforming fiber into sheet, through their own hands and judgment, the smell of pulp in a vat, wet and clean and slightly sweet, the sound of water draining through a screen, the visual beauty of fibers settling, interlacing, these sensory experiences. They connect contemporary papermakers to an unbroken tradition stretching back more than a millennium. And there's something moving in that continuity, in the knowledge that the essential process hasn't changed, can't change, because it's rooted in the nature of the materials themselves. Modern papers made for specific purposes, archival papers that resist acid degradation, papers embedded with security features, papers designed to survive specific conditions. They represent sophistication built on ancient foundations, the same basic transformation elevated by understanding, by chemistry, by engineering, but still fundamentally fiber and water and bonding. And perhaps that's the deepest lesson, that some technologies, some human innovations, they reach a kind of completion, a rightness of method that doesn't need radical reinvention, only refinement, only adaptation to new circumstances while preserving the essential truth at the core. The closing of a book, the soft sound of pages settling together, or the crisp fold of a letter, the way paper creases, holds a shape when bent. These everyday interactions, they're possible because of everything that came before, because of reeds in the Nile and mulberry bark in China, and water mills in medieval France. Paper surrounds us still, even in this digital age. Receipts and labels and packaging, cards and tickets and certificates, newspapers folding in half, pages in journals, and though we use less of it perhaps than previous generations, it hasn't disappeared, hasn't been entirely superseded, because there's something irreplaceable in the physical, in the tangible, in marks made permanent on a surface you can hold, the texture under fingertips, the slight roughness or smoothness. It provides feedback, a sensory confirmation that something exists. That thought has been captured, fixed, made real in a way that pixels on a screen, however bright, however clear, they somehow aren't standing in an archive, surrounded by centuries of paper, documents and letters and ledgers, the collective smell of all that fiber, all that sizing, all those years. It's like standing in a forest of human memory, of preserved thought, and the paper itself, the material, it made this preservation possible, this accumulation of recorded knowledge, the future of paper. It's uncertain in some ways, but perhaps certain in others, because as long as people make art, as long as we value the handmade, the unique, the beautiful, there will be paper makers working with fiber and water, creating surfaces that carry not just information but character, presence, soul, and sometimes late at night perhaps, in the quiet, you might pick up a piece of fine paper, really look at it, hold it to the light and see the fibers, the watermark if there is one, feel its weight, its texture, and in that moment you're connected to everything, to the reeds and the mulberry bark, to the rags and the water mills, to hands that learned through centuries how to transform the fibrous structure of plants into something that could hold human thought, human feeling, human knowledge. The paper rests in your hands, cream or white, or rough or smooth, and it waits, patient as paper always is, ready to receive whatever marks you choose to make, whatever words or images you need to preserve. And this readiness, this receptivity, it's paper's gift, its purpose. its quiet ongoing service to human expression. The workshops are quieter now, fewer than there were, but they exist still, and in them water pours into vats, molds dip and lift, fibers settle and bond, and new sheets emerge, one after another, continuing a tradition so old that its origins blur into legend, into the misty territory where history and story overlap. And perhaps that's fitting, that paper's beginnings are themselves written on an uncertain surface, because paper, more than almost any other material, it exists to hold stories, to preserve them, to carry them forward, and so its own story, endless and evolving, it continues, sheet by sheet, fiber by fiber, in workshops and mills and studios around the world. Wherever someone understands that this transformation, this simple miracle of plant into surface, it matters, it endures, it remains, the thought drifts now, settles like fibers in a vat, and what remains is texture, weight, the ghost of watermarks held to light, the memory of pages turning, the rustle and whisper of paper, patient, present, waiting. I settle into a quiet space tonight, where the air feels different, where the walls seem to hold something older than memory, something that breathes in rhythm with the turning of pages and the soft glow of lamplight on aged paper. There exists a field of study, one that has walked beside humanity through every century, through every culture, observing what happens when consciousness releases its grip on the waking world, when the mind crosses that threshold between alert awareness and the territory beyond, where thoughts become images, where time bends, where the body undergoes its nightly transformation. This field has many names across many languages, but in the scholarly circles, in the research halls and university departments, it carries a particular designation, one that speaks to the watching, the measuring, the careful documentation of that universal human experience that arrives each night like a tide. Somnology, the study of what occurs in those hours of darkness, when approximately 1/3 of every human life unfolds in an altered state, when the brain shifts into patterns that researchers can now map with electrodes and screens, when the body repairs itself through processes we are only beginning to understand. I find myself drawn tonight to the story of this field, to the scholars who dedicated their lives to understanding something so familiar, yet so mysterious, something that happens to every person, every night, yet remains in many ways as enigmatic as the far side of the moon. The history of somnology stretches back further than most imagine, back to ancient civilizations who recorded their observations in temples and on papyrus scrolls, who noticed patterns, who wondered about the visions that came in darkness, who asked questions that would echo through millennia. But the formal study, the systematic investigation with instruments and protocols, with laboratories and peer-reviewed journals, this emerged more recently in a particular moment of human history when the tools finally matched the curiosity, when electricity allowed scientists to measure the invisible currents flowing through the brain, when photography could capture the subtle movements of the eyes beneath closed lids. I imagine those early pioneers sitting in dimly lit rooms, watching volunteers lie still on examination tables, electrode paste being applied to scalps with careful precision, the scratch of pen on paper as waves appeared on rolling drums of graph paper. each line a window into processes that had been hidden since the first human ancestor closed their eyes under a prehistoric sky. The field emerged from neurology, from psychology, from medicine, a convergence of disciplines, all asking related questions about consciousness, about health, about what it means to be human, about why we spend so many hours in this particular state, what purpose it serves, what happens when it goes wrong. And the questions multiplied, branching like neurons themselves, creating networks of inquiry that spread through universities across continents, drawing in physicians and psychiatrists, physiologists and pharmacologists, each bringing their own tools, their own perspectives, their own pieces of a vast puzzle. I think about the waiting rooms of those early clinics, the patients who arrived with complaints that had troubled them for years, unable to achieve what should come naturally, or achieving it too easily at the wrong times, in the wrong ways, or their lives disrupted by disturbances in a process that most people never think about, that happens automatically, like breathing, like heartbeat. The clinicians listened and began to categorize, to create taxonomies of disorders, to recognize patterns, to see that what seemed like individual struggles were often shared experiences, that there were types, classifications, conditions that could be named, understood, potentially treated. Research laboratories sprouted in medical schools, in government facilities, in hospital basements, rooms lined with equipment that hummed and blinked, recording data through the night while the world outside grew quiet, while researchers took turns monitoring screens, documenting every twitch, every breath, every shift in brainwave frequency. The field attracted a particular kind of mind, those comfortable with paradox, with studying consciousness by observing its absence, with measuring life during a time that resembles a kind of temporary death, when the conscious self departs and something else takes over, something automatic, ancient, beyond voluntary control. I see them in my mind, these somnologists, equally at home in the clinic and the laboratory, speaking the language of both hard science and human suffering, translating between the objective measurements of machines and the subjective experiences of patients, building bridges between data and lived experience, and the applications began to emerge, slowly at first, then accelerating as understanding deepened, as techniques improved, as the connections became clear between what happened in those dark hours and the quality of waking life, between disturbances in one realm and suffering in the other, between restoration achieved or denied and health maintained or lost. The field grew, developed subspecialties, created professional organizations, launched journals, held conferences where researchers from different nations shared their findings, compared their methodologies, debated their interpretations, gradually constructing a body of knowledge where before there had been mostly speculation and folk wisdom. Tonight, I follow this thread backward into the origins, into the moments when somnology transformed from scattered observations into a genuine science, when the questions became systematic, when the tools became precise enough to reveal what had always been hidden, when humanity began to truly see into the night. The story begins, as many scientific stories do, not with a single moment of discovery, but with accumulated questions, with observations that didn't quite fit, with physicians noticing patterns they couldn't explain through the medical understanding of their time. In the late 1800s, doctors across Europe and America began keeping detailed records of their patients, noting everything, including complaints about the night, about difficulty entering that natural state, about experiences during darkness that seemed to affect daytime functioning, about exhaustion that no amount of rest could repair. These physicians worked in an era before electricity became common, when nights were truly dark, when the rhythms of human life still followed more closely the rising and setting of the sun. Yet even then, people reported disturbances, difficulties, patterns that suggested something complex was happening in those hours between dusk and dawn. A French physician named Marie de Manassein conducted some of the earliest systematic experiments, working with puppies in the 1880s, depriving them of what came naturally, watching what happened when this basic process was interrupted, documenting the deterioration, the physiological breakdown, proving that this wasn't merely restful inactivity, but something essential to life itself. Her work was radical for its time, suggesting that these hours of apparent unconsciousness served vital functions, that the body and mind required this state, that it wasn't laziness or weakness, but biological necessity, a need as fundamental as food or water. Around the same time, in Russia, a scientist named Cesar Mansurov was measuring heat radiation from the human body across the full cycle of day and night, noticing fluctuations, patterns that repeated, evidence of internal clocks, of rhythms built into human physiology that operated whether someone was conscious of them or not. The pieces were scattered across different disciplines, different countries, different languages, not yet assembled into a coherent picture, but the foundation was being laid, the questions were being asked, the tools were being developed. In Vienna, Sigmund Freud was exploring a different angle, examining the content of what occurred during darkness, the images and narratives that arose, treating them as messages from the unconscious mind, as symbolic communications that could reveal hidden conflicts, repressed desires, unresolved traumas. His approach was interpretive rather than physiological, focused on meaning rather than mechanism, but it drew attention to the richness of nocturnal mental life, to the complexity of what happens when the rational mind releases control, when deeper layers of psyche express themselves in symbolic form. Meanwhile, neurologists were beginning to understand that the brain didn't simply shut down during these hours, that it remained active, that it consumed resources, that something was happening beyond mere rest, though what exactly remained mysterious, hidden behind closed eyes and the privacy of the skull. The early 20th century brought new technologies, new possibilities for observation. The electroencephalogram was developed in the 1920s by Hans Berger, a German psychiatrist who managed to record the electrical activity of the human brain, to translate neural firing into visible waves on paper, to make the invisible visible. Berger's invention was transformative. Suddenly, researchers could see that the brain showed different patterns of activity during different states, that waking consciousness produced one signature, that the transition into unconsciousness produced another, that the night was not uniform but consisted of different phases, different types of brain activity, different states within the larger state. His first recordings were made on his own son, Klaus, electrodes placed on the young man's scalp, connected to a sensitive galvanometer, producing the first glimpses of what would later be called alpha waves, beta waves, delta waves, the rhythms of consciousness in different modes. This was the 1920s, the same decade that brought jazz and radio, Model T Fords and talking pictures, and also these first tentative views into the electrical landscape of the mind, these tracings that would become the foundation of modern somnology. But the interpretation of these waves, the understanding of what they meant, this would take decades more of careful observation, of correlating the electrical signatures with behavioral states, with subjective reports, with physiological measurements. In the 1930s, a researcher named Alfred Loomis, working in his private laboratory in Tuxedo Park, New York, conducted some of the first detailed studies using electroencephalography, specifically to examine what happened during the night. He documented the descent into deeper states, the progression through stages, the changes in brainwave amplitude and frequency as consciousness faded. Loomis was not a physician, but a wealthy attorney and physicist who had made his fortune in utilities and power generation. He built a laboratory in his estate, equipped it with the most advanced instruments, and invited scientists to conduct research there, creating a unique environment where curiosity could be pursued without the constraints of academic institutions. His work on nocturnal brain activity was meticulous, involving volunteers who spent nights in his laboratory while electrodes recorded their neural patterns, while observers noted their breathing, their movements, their transitions between states. Building the first detailed maps of the night's architecture, he identified 5 distinct stages, labeled A through E, representing progressively deeper levels, a taxonomy that would later be refined, but whose essential insight remained, that the night was not one thing but many, a journey through different territories, each with its own characteristics, its own electrical signature. This was fundamental, this recognition of structure, of stages, of a repeating cycle that played out across the hours of darkness. It transformed how researchers thought about nocturnal physiology from a simple binary of wake and not wake to a complex landscape with its own geography, its own rhythms. World War II interrupted much civilian research, but also created urgent needs. Military strategists wanted to understand fatigue, to know how long soldiers could function without proper rest, how to optimize schedules for pilots and submariners, how to maintain alertness during long watches, how to recover quickly from deprivation. The military-funded studies created laboratories dedicated to these questions, brought together researchers who might not otherwise have collaborated, generated data on extreme conditions, on the limits of human endurance, on what happens when the natural cycle is severely disrupted. After the war, this research infrastructure didn't disappear. It transitioned. Many military researchers moved into civilian academia, bringing their expertise, their equipment, their questions, helping to establish somnology as a legitimate field of scientific inquiry. The 1950s brought what many consider the field's defining discovery. At the University of Chicago, a graduate student named Eugene Oserinsky was working in the laboratory of Nathaniel Kleitman, studying children's nocturnal eye movements, using equipment that could detect motion beneath closed lids. Oserinsky noticed something strange. periods during the night when the eyes moved rapidly, darting back and forth as if watching something, as if the person was awake. But they clearly weren't. They were deeply unconscious, unresponsive to gentle stimuli, yet their eyes danced beneath their lids. He tested his equipment, thinking it might be malfunctioning, but the pattern repeated. Night after night, in child after child, these periods of rapid eye movement appearing at regular intervals, approximately every 90 minutes, lasting for several minutes, then subsiding, then appearing again. Kleitman was skeptical at first, but the data was undeniable. They expanded their studies to adults, confirmed the phenomenon, and then had the crucial insight to wake people during these periods, to ask what they had been experiencing. The reports were vivid, detailed, narrative. The subjects described complex scenarios, visual scenes, emotional experiences. They had been somewhere else, doing something, experiencing events that felt real in the moment. This was when the visions occurred, during these periods of rapid eye movement, during what would come to be called REM, a state unlike any other, paradoxical, the brain highly active, yet the body paralyzed, consciousness absent, yet mental life rich and strange. This discovery in 1953 changed everything. It revealed that the night contained not just deeper and lighter states of unconsciousness, but an entirely different kind of consciousness, a special state where the mind created entire worlds, where narrative and image flowed without conscious direction, where the laws of physics and logic bent, where anything could happen. The implications cascaded through multiple fields. Neurologists suddenly had a new phenomenon to explain. Psychiatrists saw potential connections to mental health. Physiologists discovered that different body systems behaved differently during REM, that breathing became irregular, that heart rate varied, that sexual arousal occurred, that the body's temperature regulation shifted. This was a state unto itself, not simply light unconsciousness, but something unique, something that seemed to serve its own purposes, that followed its own rules, that occupied roughly 20 to 25% of the night in adults, that infants spent even more time in, suggesting it might be important for development, for learning, for something essential that happened in this peculiar twilight. The discovery of REM opened floodgates. Suddenly, laboratories dedicated to somnology appeared at universities across the United States and Europe. Suddenly, funding became available. Suddenly, the field attracted talented researchers who saw opportunities to make fundamental discoveries about consciousness, about the brain, about human nature. The 1950s and 60s became a golden age of basic research. Scientists mapping the neural circuits involved, identifying the brain regions that controlled transitions between states, discovering neurotransmitters that regulated the cycle, understanding the homeostatic mechanisms that built pressure for unconsciousness during prolonged waking, that dissipated that pressure across the night. They discovered the suprachiasmatic nucleus, a tiny region in the hypothalamus containing perhaps 20,000 neurons that acted as a master clock, responding to light, coordinating the timing of countless physiological processes, orchestrating the daily rhythm of alertness and drowsiness, keeping biological time. They found that this clock ran on approximately a 24-hour cycle, even in the absence of external cues, that people placed in environments without time markers, without clocks or windows or schedules, would naturally settle into rhythms close to but not exactly 24 hours, drifting slowly out of sync with the solar day, proving the clock was internal, biological, ancient. Clinical applications began to emerge from this basic research. Physicians started to recognize specific disorders, to see patterns in their patients' complaints, to develop diagnostic criteria, to create treatment protocols based on scientific understanding rather than guesswork. The first formal clinics appeared, dedicated spaces where people could be observed overnight, where their physiology could be monitored, where recordings could be made, where the invisible could be rendered visible through the traces of brain waves, eye movements, muscle tension, breathing, heart rate, all synchronized, all telling a story about what was happening in the darkness. These early clinics were humble places, often just converted hospital rooms, equipped with borrowed instruments, staffed by physicians who believed that understanding nocturnal physiology could unlock mysteries of health and disease, who saw connections between what happened in darkness and suffering in daylight. The procedure became standardized. Patients would arrive in the evening. Electrodes would be carefully attached. Small metal discs glued to specific positions on the scalp, following the International 1020 system, a map of the skull that ensured consistency across laboratories, across continents, allowing researchers to compare their findings. More electrodes near the eyes to capture movement, electrodes on the chin to measure muscle tone, belts around the chest and abdomen to record breathing, a sensor on the finger to track heart rate and oxygen levels, wires everywhere, connecting the person to machines that translated physiology into ink, traces on scrolling paper. The patients would lie in unfamiliar beds, in sterile rooms, trying to achieve what needed to happen despite the strangeness, despite the awareness of being watched, despite the physical constraint of all those wires, and remarkably, most did. The need was strong enough, the biological imperative powerful enough, that even in these artificial conditions, consciousness would eventually release its grip, and the technicians would watch, sitting in adjacent rooms, observing the traces appearing on paper, watching the progression through stages, noting the times of transitions, the durations of each phase, building databases of normal patterns, establishing baselines against which abnormality could be measured. The paper scrolled endlessly, 30 seconds per page, creating huge stacks by morning, each page a window into a few moments of brain activity, of physiological state, the entire night producing a document that might stretch across a room when laid out, a physical manifestation of the invisible processes. By the 1970s, the field had matured enough to establish formal professional organizations. The Association for the Psychophysiological Study of Sleep was founded in 1961, later becoming the Sleep Research Society, creating a community, a shared identity, a framework for collaboration and standardization. Clinicians developed scoring systems, rules for interpreting the traces, for identifying which stage was which. William Dement and Alan Rechtschaffen published their manual in 1968, creating a common language, a standardized method. Their system divided the night into stages 1 through 4 of non-REM plus REM itself, each defined by specific patterns of brain waves, specific combinations of frequencies and amplitudes. Stage 1 was the lightest, The transition, when alpha waves of relaxed waking gave way to slower theta rhythms, when consciousness began to dissolve, when the person might still respond to quiet sounds, might still have some awareness of surroundings. This lasted just minutes in most people, a doorway rather than a destination. Stage 2 brought sleep spindles, brief bursts of rapid waves, 12 to 14 cycles per second, and K complexes, sharp negative peaks followed by positive rebounds. These were distinctive markers, signatures of true unconsciousness, though still relatively light, still easy to wake from. This stage occupied the largest portion of the night, perhaps half of all the time spent in darkness. Stages 3 and 4 were defined by the appearance of delta waves, slow, high amplitude, less than 4 cycles per second, the deep states, where the brain showed synchronized firing, where awakening required strong stimuli, where the person roused with confusion, disorientation, needing time to reassemble their sense of self and place. These deep stages predominated in the first half of the night. The body seemed to prioritize them, to need them most urgently. They were when growth hormones surged, when tissue repair occurred, when the immune system performed its maintenance, when the brain's metabolic waste was cleared through a system of channels discovered much later, a kind of nocturnal housekeeping essential to cellular health. REM appeared approximately 90 minutes after onset. The first episode brief, perhaps 10 minutes, subsequent episodes lengthening. The final REM period before waking might last half an hour or more. This was when the most vivid and bizarre narratives occurred, when the visual cortex activated intensely, when emotional centers lit up, when the motor cortex sent signals to move, but those signals were blocked, intercepted by inhibitory neurons in the brain stem that paralyzed the voluntary muscles, preventing the body from acting out the internal drama. This paralysis was protective. Researchers discovered cases where it failed, where people physically enacted their nocturnal experiences, sometimes injuring themselves or others, sometimes performing complex behaviors while completely unconscious, sleepwalking during REM, a dangerous confusion of states, a breakdown of the normal boundaries. The field began to catalog disorders, to recognize patterns. Insomnia came in many forms: difficulty initiating the process, difficulty maintaining it, early morning awakening, each type suggesting different underlying mechanisms, different potential treatments. Some people experienced excessive daytime drowsiness. Despite spending adequate time in bed, they would fall unconscious at inappropriate moments, while talking, while eating, their brains unable to maintain waking consciousness. Narcolepsy was identified, a disorder where REM intruded into waking, where muscle paralysis occurred during the day, where people might collapse suddenly, where the boundaries between states broke down catastrophically. Others stopped breathing during the night, their airways collapsing, oxygen levels dropping, the brain forcing brief awakenings to restore breathing. This cycle repeating hundreds of times, fragmenting the night's architecture, preventing the deeper stages from occurring, leaving people exhausted despite spending 8 or 9 hours in bed. Obstructive sleep apnea became recognized as a major health problem linked to cardiovascular disease, to cognitive decline, to accidents and impaired daytime functioning. Restless leg syndrome was documented, an irresistible urge to move, a creeping discomfort that appeared in the evening that prevented the transition into unconsciousness, that drove people to pace their homes in the dark hours, seeking relief that came only with movement. Periodic limb movements were recorded, legs jerking rhythmically during the night, disrupting the normal progression through stages, fragmenting what should be continuous, creating a kind of chaos in the night's structure. Parasomnias emerged as a category, unusual behaviors arising from partial arousals, sleepwalking during deep non-REM, people performing complex actions with no awareness, no memory, their brains caught between waking and sleeping, capable of navigation and manipulation, but without conscious guidance. Night terrors in children, sudden episodes of intense fear, screaming, autonomic arousal, heart racing, breathing rapid, yet the child unaware, unable to be comforted. The episode arising from deep non-REM, different from nightmares, more primal, more physiological, REM behavior disorder in older adults, the paralysis failing, allowing physical enactment, sometimes violent, sometimes dangerous, often an early sign of neurodegenerative disease, a warning that something was changing in the brain's regulatory systems. The field developed treatments, behavioral interventions, cognitive therapy for insomnia, teaching people to reassociate the bed with unconsciousness rather than wakefulness, to limit time in bed to match actual capacity, to create conditions conducive to natural transition, continuous positive airway pressure devices, CPAP machines, delivering pressurized air through masks, keeping airways open, preventing the collapse, allowing breathing to continue, allowing the normal architecture to unfold, life-changing for many, but requiring adaptation, learning to tolerate the mask, the pressure, the noise, the sensation of forced air. Medications were explored, substances that enhanced certain neurotransmitter systems, that promoted the transition, that lengthened duration, but each came with costs, with side effects, with risks of dependence, with changes to the natural architecture, suppressing REM, reducing deep stages, trading quantity for quality or quality for quantity. Light therapy emerged for circadian rhythm disorders, bright light in the morning to shift the clock earlier, in the evening to shift it later, helping people whose internal rhythms were misaligned with their social obligations, whose biology insisted on late nights when the world demanded early mornings, or who woke at 3 a.m. when they desperately wanted to remain unconscious until 7. The field expanded internationally. Laboratories opened in Japan, studying the relationship between cultural practices and nocturnal patterns. In Israel, exploring the biology of shift work in a nation with many 24-hour operations. In Scandinavian countries, where seasonal light variations created natural experiments in circadian regulation, researchers discovered that light was the primary synchronizer, the Zeitgeber, the time giver, that kept the internal clock aligned with the solar day. That special photoreceptors in the retina detected blue wavelengths, sent signals directly to the suprachiasmatic nucleus, communicating whether it was day or night, whether the clock should advance or delay. This explained why artificial light, especially in the evening, could shift rhythms later, why bright screens before bed interfered with the transition, why our modern light-saturated environment might be fundamentally mismatched with our evolved biology, why epidemic levels of difficulty achieving natural unconsciousness coincided with the electrification of nights. Animal studies revealed conserved mechanisms. Fruit flies showed rest activity cycles, even though they had no cerebral cortex, even though their nervous systems were organized completely differently, suggesting that the need for this alternation between states was ancient, fundamental, that it solved some basic problem of being alive, of having a nervous system, of existing in time. Every animal studied showed some form of the pattern. Fish, amphibians, reptiles, birds, mammals, each with variations, some polyphasic, sleeping in multiple bouts across the day and night, some monophasic like most modern humans, concentrating it into one long period. Dolphins, sleeping with one hemisphere at a time, keeping the other awake to surface for breathing. Birds, showing brief periods that might last only seconds, yet showing the characteristic brain patterns, the electrical signatures of true unconsciousness. The universality suggested importance, suggested that evolution had preserved these mechanisms across hundreds of millions of years, that something vital happened during these states, something worth the vulnerability, worth the time, worth the complex neural machinery required to orchestrate the transitions, to maintain the boundaries, to cycle regularly through stages. The late 20th century brought technological revolution to somnology. Computers replaced paper recordings, digitizing the traces, allowing new forms of analysis. Pattern recognition algorithms could scan entire nights in seconds, identifying stages automatically, though human experts still reviewed the results, still applied judgment, still interpreted ambiguous sections. Portable monitoring became possible. Devices small enough to send home with patients to record data in their own beds, in their familiar environments, liberating diagnosis from the laboratory, making assessment more accessible, more representative of typical nights, though sacrificing some detail, some precision, accepting that trade-off for ecological validity. Brain imaging technologies emerged, positron emission tomography in the 1980s, functional magnetic resonance imaging in the 1990s, allowing researchers to see which brain regions were active during different states, to watch blood flow shift, to observe metabolism change, to map the neural geography of consciousness and its absence. These images revealed patterns that electrophysiology alone couldn't show. During deep non-REM, the frontal cortex quieted, the regions responsible for executive function, for planning and judgment, for sense of self, they dimmed, their activity falling to levels never seen during waking, suggesting a profound disconnection, a genuine absence of the conscious self. During REM, the pattern was different. Visual areas blazed with activity. Emotional centers in the limbic system, the amygdala, showed heightened activation, but the dorsolateral prefrontal cortex remained quiet, the area that normally provides reality testing, logical analysis, critical judgment. This explained the bizarre acceptance, the dream logic, the willingness to believe impossible things, the lack of metacognition, the inability to recognize that what was happening couldn't be real. The motor cortex activated during REM, sending commands to move, to run, to gesture, but the brainstem blocked those commands, the subcortical inhibition preventing movement, creating a strange dissociation between intention and action, between neural command and bodily response. Molecular biology joined the investigation. Researchers identified genes involved in circadian timing, the period genes, the clock genes, the cryptochrome genes, proteins that oscillated in concentration across the day, creating feedback loops, biochemical clocks running in nearly every cell, all synchronized by the master clock in the suprachiasmatic nucleus. They discovered that disrupting these genes in animals, creating mutations, led to disordered rhythms, to fragmented patterns, to health problems, confirming that the molecular clockwork was essential, that timing mattered at the cellular level, that when these rhythms were disrupted, physiology suffered. Studies of shift workers revealed consequences. People whose schedules forced them to work during their biological night, to attempt unconsciousness during their biological day, showed increased risks of cardiovascular disease, of metabolic disorders, of certain cancers, of cognitive decline, suggesting that chronic misalignment between internal timing and external demands carried serious health costs. Jet lag became understood not as mere fatigue, but as temporary circadian disruption, the internal clock taking days to realign with a new time zone, different systems resynchronizing at different rates, creating a kind of internal desynchronization, a transient chaos of timing until all the clocks gradually converged on the new schedule. The field recognized that modern life created chronic circadian challenges, electric light allowing activity at any hour, shift work, transatlantic flights, screens emitting blue wavelengths in the evening, caffeine consumed late in the day, all pushing against the evolved biology, creating what some researchers call social jet lag, a persistent mismatch between biological time and social time. Epidemiological studies in the late 1990s and early 2000s documented widespread patterns, surveys across populations, time use, diaries, objective monitoring with wrist-worn sensors, building pictures of how people actually spent their nights, how durations had changed across decades, how patterns varied by age, by culture, by occupation. The data suggested that average durations had declined, that people in industrialized nations were allocating less time to darkness than previous generations, that the 24/7 economy, the always-on culture, the pervasive presence of screens and artificial light had gradually eroded the hours traditionally reserved for unconsciousness. Researchers found associations between short duration and obesity, between fragmented patterns and diabetes, between chronic insufficiency and depression, between poor quality and cardiovascular disease, though causality was difficult to establish, bidirectional relationships common, each condition potentially influencing the other. Neuroscience revealed functions during deep non-REM. Synaptic homeostasis occurred, the strengthening and weakening of connections. The brain had spent the day forming new synapses, building connections. During deep stages, the less important connections were pruned. The signal-to-noise ratio improved. Memories consolidated, moving from temporary storage in the hippocampus to more permanent storage in the cortex. During REM, different processes unfolded. Emotional memories were processed, the charge gradually removed from disturbing experiences, allowing people to remember events without reliving the full emotional intensity, a kind of overnight therapy occurring naturally every night when all went well. The glymphatic system was discovered in 2012, a network of channels around blood vessels in the brain, more active during unconsciousness, flushing metabolic waste, clearing proteins that accumulated during waking, including amyloid beta, the protein that forms plaques in Alzheimer's disease, suggesting that chronic insufficiency might allow toxic accumulation, might increase neurodegenerative risk. Research in the 2000s and 2010s explored the relationship between nocturnal patterns and learning. Students kept awake after training showed impaired memory consolidation. Animals prevented from entering particular stages showed specific deficits. REM deprivation affecting procedural learning, deep non-REM deprivation affecting declarative memory, each stage contributing something different, each necessary for optimal cognitive function. Athletic performance studies showed that extension improved reaction times, accuracy, endurance. Professional teams began prioritizing it, building schedules to allow adequate recovery, recognizing that physical restoration required time, required the deep stages when growth hormones surged, when protein synthesis peaked, when damaged tissues repaired themselves. Mental health research revealed bidirectional relationships. Depression often involved early morning awakening, inability to maintain unconsciousness. Anxiety involved difficulty initiating it, racing thoughts, preventing the transition, but treatment of the disturbances often improved mood, suggesting that the relationship ran both ways, that fixing the night might help fix the day. Cognitive behavioral therapy for insomnia, CBTI, emerged as a highly effective treatment, sometimes more effective than medication. Teaching people to work with their biology rather than against it, to strengthen the circadian signal, to build pressure through controlled restriction, to break associations between bed and wakefulness, empowering people to influence their own patterns through behavior change. The field matured into the 21st century with established standards, board certification for physicians specializing in the field, accreditation for clinics, quality metrics, evidence-based guidelines, a substantial research literature, textbooks, training programs, a professional infrastructure. Technology continued advancing. Home diagnostic tests became available. Disposable sensors that could screen for apnea, smartphone apps that use the device's accelerometer to estimate movement, attempts to democratize assessment, though with varying accuracy, with questions about what people did with the information, whether self-diagnosis led to appropriate care or to anxiety and confusion. Wearable devices proliferated, watches and rings claiming to track stages, using heart rate variability, using movement, algorithms translating these signals into estimates of light and deep states, of REM percentage, of efficiency. The data often flawed, the validation limited, but millions of people suddenly had nightly reports, had numbers, had trends over time. This quantification was double-edged. It raised awareness. It helped some people recognize patterns, but it also created anxiety. Orthosomnia emerged as a term, excessive concern with achieving perfect metrics. People becoming distressed over their device's report even when they felt fine. Technology meant to help creating a new form of worry. The field grappled with these developments, with the democratization of monitoring, with the proliferation of advice, with apps promising to improve quality through sounds or lights or breathing exercises, some evidence-based, many not. the expertise that had taken decades to develop suddenly competing with algorithms and marketing claims. Researchers continued pushing boundaries, exploring consciousness itself through the lens of its absence, studying how anesthesia differed from natural unconsciousness, how coma differed from both, mapping the neural correlates of awareness, of responsiveness, of the subjective sense of existing in time. Some investigated lucid states, those rare occasions when people became aware within the narrative, recognized they were experiencing something generated internally, could sometimes exert control, could choose to fly or to face a feared scenario. These states offering unique windows into consciousness, into the relationship between awareness and agency, into the constructed nature of all experience. Others explored the hypnagogic state, the transition, the moments between waking and unconsciousness, when thoughts became strange, when logic dissolved, when images appeared spontaneously, when creative insights sometimes emerged. That liminal zone that some artists and inventors had deliberately cultivated, that Edison reportedly accessed by napping while holding ball bearings that would clatter when his hands relaxed, waking him at the edge in that fertile twilight. The field had traveled far from those early observations in the 19th century, from speculation about purposes to detailed understanding of mechanisms, from crude behavioral monitoring to molecular genetics, from philosophical puzzles to clinical treatments, yet mysteries remained. Fundamental questions still unanswered. Why did consciousness need to be interrupted? Why couldn't the brain perform its maintenance functions while remaining aware? What was it about unconsciousness specifically that enabled the necessary processes? Why had evolution created this vulnerability, this daily diminishment, this regular dissolution of the self? What determined individual differences? Why some people needed only 6 hours while others required 9? Why some were naturally early while others were constitutionally late? How much was genetic? How much was malleable? Whether these differences were problems to be fixed or variations to be accommodated? What was the full function of REM? Why did the brain create elaborate narratives? Why the bizarre logic? Why the emotional intensity? Whether these visions served purposes beyond memory consolidation, whether they contributed to creativity, to emotional regulation, to something else entirely, the field stood at a curious juncture, knowing vastly more than the pioneers of a century earlier, yet still confronting fundamental mysteries, still unable to explain fully why this daily rhythm existed. What essential thing happened when consciousness dissolved? Why 1/3 of life necessarily unfolded in absence and alteration? And so the field of somnology stands today, a discipline that has mapped the territory between waking and something else, that has measured what seems immeasurable, that has brought scientific rigor to something as intimate and universal as breathing, as inevitable as mortality. The journey from those first crude observations to contemporary understanding spans barely more than a century, a brief moment in human history. Yet in that time, researchers have illuminated processes that unfolded in darkness for millions of years before anyone thought to ask why, before anyone had tools to investigate, before the questions could even be properly formulated. There is something profound in this, in the application of consciousness to study its own absence, in the use of waking awareness to understand what happens when awareness departs. A kind of epistemological loop, the mind examining the spaces where mind temporarily ceases, finding structure there, finding purpose, finding complexity that rivals waking experience. The somnologist discovered that what seemed simple was layered, that what seemed passive was active, that the apparent nothingness contained multitudes, stages within stages, rhythms within rhythms, the 90-minute cycle repeating through the night like a sonata with variations, each iteration slightly different, the proportion of deep and light shifting as the hours passed, the architecture adapting to the changing needs of the organism. They found that this wasn't merely rest, but transformation, that the person who emerged at dawn was not quite the same as the one who lay down at dusk. Memories had been processed, reorganized. Emotional charges had been modulated. Cellular damage had been repaired. Toxins had been cleared. Immune function had been calibrated. Hormones had been regulated. The body and brain had been maintained, prepared for another cycle, another day of consciousness and action. The field revealed connections between the night and nearly every aspect of health: cardiovascular function, metabolic regulation, immune competence, emotional stability, cognitive performance, physical restoration, all dependent on what happened in darkness, all suffering when the architecture was disrupted, when duration was insufficient, when quality was poor. This knowledge has practical implications, clinical applications, treatments that help those for whom the natural process fails, devices that keep airways open, therapies that retrain behavior, medications that modulate neurotransmitter systems, light boxes that shift circadian phase, a toolkit built on understanding, on decades of careful observation and experimentation. But beyond the clinical, beyond the therapeutic, somnology offers something else, a window into human nature, into the rhythms that structure existence, into the biological imperatives that shape experience even when we're unaware of them, into the deep history written into our cells, into our genes, into the architecture of our brains. Every person carries within them this ancient pattern, this alternation between presence and absence, this daily dissolution and reconstitution of the self, inherited from ancestors who experienced it under different skies, in different circumstances, but with the same fundamental biology, the same neural mechanisms, the same circadian clocks ticking in their cells. The field has documented how culture and biology interact, how human societies have organized time in countless ways, but always within constraints set by physiology, by the need for darkness and light, by the pressure that builds across waking hours, by the restoration that can only occur during unconsciousness. Biology setting boundaries within which culture improvises. Some societies embraced segmented patterns, first and second periods with a quiet, wakeful interval between. This was common in pre-industrial Europe. People would rise in the middle of the night, engage in quiet activities, conversation, prayer, intimate relations, then return to a second period before dawn, a pattern that modern research suggests may align with the natural tendencies when artificial light doesn't extend the evening. Other cultures developed siesta traditions, shorter nocturnal durations supplemented by daytime rest, working with the postprandial dip in alertness, the slight circadian trough in mid-afternoon, dividing the daily requirement between night and day, rather than consolidating it into one long block. Modern industrial society imposed new patterns, fixed schedules, alarm clocks, shift work, overnight flights, an environment of constant light and activity, and somnology has documented the consequences, has measured the costs, has provided evidence that this mismatch between biology and society contributes to widespread health problems, to the chronic diseases that plague contemporary populations. Yet the field also offers hope, offers interventions, offers understanding that can empower people to work with their biology rather than against it, to create conditions conducive to natural processes, to prioritize something that evolution deemed essential, that receives less cultural validation than work or productivity or entertainment. But that underlies all of those. That makes them possible. The researchers who dedicated their careers to this field, who spent their nights watching others in darkness, who analyzed endless traces on paper and screens, who built the knowledge base increment by increment. They created something valuable. They illuminated a territory that was always there but never seen clearly. They brought light to the study of darkness, consciousness to the investigation of its absence. Their work continues. New questions emerging, new technologies enabling investigations that weren't previously possible, neuroimaging with ever higher resolution, genetic studies identifying polymorphisms that influence circadian timing, computational models simulating the complex interactions between neural circuits, pharmaceutical research targeting specific receptor systems, each advance opening new possibilities, revealing new layers of complexity. And perhaps that is the deepest lesson of somnology, that what seems most familiar, most mundane, most automatic, contains depths worth exploring, that the everyday contains the extraordinary, that what we take for granted is actually remarkable, worthy of wonder, worthy of careful attention and systematic study. The field reminds us that we are biological beings, embedded in time, shaped by rhythms older than our species, than our genus, than our evolutionary family, rhythms that connect us to all life, to the rotation of the planet, to the fundamental patterns of existence in a cosmos that pulses with cycles, with oscillations, with repetitions at every scale. I find myself returning to the beginning, to those early observers who noticed patterns, who asked questions, who wondered about purposes, their curiosity leading to this entire edifice of knowledge, this discipline that now encompasses thousands of researchers, hundreds of laboratories, millions of patients, countless nights of observation and measurement. The journey feels complete, in a sense, from mystery to understanding, from speculation to science, from darkness to illumination. Yet the journey also continues, each answer revealing new questions, each solved puzzle exposing deeper layers, the territory expanding even as it becomes better mapped. Somnology stands as a testament to human curiosity, to the drive to understand, to the application of systematic inquiry to even the most intimate aspects of existence. It has taken something private, something that happens alone, in darkness, behind closed doors and closed eyes, and made it public, shareable, knowable, through careful observation and reasoned interpretation. The field has honored both the subjective and the objective, both the personal experience and the measurable physiology, both the narrative and the neural activity, recognizing that full understanding requires attention to multiple levels, that consciousness and its absence are too complex for any single approach, any single methodology, any single discipline. And now, as I consider the full sweep of this history, the arc from those first tentative investigations to contemporary neuroscience, I feel a kind of appreciation for the researchers who persevered, who built incrementally, who collaborated across borders and disciplines, who created something useful, something beautiful in its way, a body of knowledge about something essential to being human. The story of somnology is really a story about attention, about bringing sustained focus to what usually passes unnoticed, about deciding that something deserves investigation even if it seems ordinary, about trusting that systematic observation will reveal patterns, will generate insights, will eventually yield understanding. It is a story about time, about rhythms, about the structure that organizes experience even when we're unaware of it, about cycles that repeat but never quite the same, about the interplay of biology and environment, of internal clocks and external cues, of individual variation within species-wide patterns. And it is a story about caring for human well-being, about recognizing that health requires more than treating disease, that it requires supporting the natural processes that maintain the organism, that it requires understanding and working with biology rather than ignoring or overriding it. That knowledge can empower people to make choices that serve their deeper needs. The field of somnology continues its work tonight. Researchers in laboratories, clinicians in centers, technicians monitoring equipment, all engaged in the ongoing project of understanding, all contributing pieces to the larger puzzle, all illuminating aspects of this fundamental rhythm, this daily transformation, this universal human experience, and their work matters, not just for those who struggle, who suffer from disorders, who need clinical intervention, but for everyone. For understanding this aspect of existence deepens appreciation, enriches perspective, connects us to our biology, to our evolutionary heritage, to the natural world of which we remain part despite our technology, despite our artificial environments, despite our attempts to transcend biological constraints. The night still calls, still invites, still offers its particular gifts, the restoration, the processing, the maintenance that can only happen in darkness, in unconsciousness, in that mysterious state that somnology has studied but never fully explained, never completely demystified, never reduced to simple mechanism. Some mystery remains, some wonder persists. Even after all the measurements, after all the theories, after all the discoveries, the essential experience retains something ineffable, something beyond complete analysis. And perhaps that is as it should be. Perhaps some territories should remain partially unknown, partially wild, partially beyond the reach of full comprehension. The field has given us much understanding, treatments, insights, but it has also reminded us of limits, of how much remains to be learned, of how even the most familiar experiences contain depths we have barely begun to plumb, of how being human involves participating in processes we don't fully control, don't fully understand, but can choose to honor, to support, to allow. And with that thought, this exploration comes to rest, not with certainty, but with appreciation, not with complete answers, but with better questions, not with the end of inquiry, but with recognition of how far we have come, and how much territory still lies ahead, waiting in the darkness for those curious enough to investigate, patient enough to observe, dedicated enough to pursue understanding wherever it leads. I stand now in a quiet place, a place where marble columns once rose toward an impossibly blue sky, where footsteps echoed on stone worn smooth by countless sandaled feet, and where voices, urgent, questioning, endlessly curious, filled the air with ideas that would ripple forward through millennia. The light here is golden and slanting, the kind of light that comes in late afternoon when the sun hangs low over distant hills, casting everything in amber and honey, softening the edges of the world until even the hardest stone seems to glow from within. I can almost see them, these figures in simple robes, walking beneath colonnades, sitting in the shade of olive trees, their hands moving as they speak, gesturing toward the heavens, or tracing invisible diagrams in the dust at their feet. Men who devoted their lives not to conquest or commerce, but to something far more elusive, the pursuit of a wisdom, the examination of existence itself. This is ancient Greece, a world of city-states perched on rocky peninsulas, of harbors filled with trading vessels, of amphitheaters carved into hillsides, and of agoras, those bustling public squares where citizens gathered to debate and discuss, to buy and sell, to argue and learn, but more than any marketplace or monument, more than any temple or theater. What defined this world was the presence of philosophers, thinkers who looked at the same sun and sea and stars that everyone else saw, and asked different questions, not how to navigate by the stars, but what the stars were made of, not how to appease the gods, but whether the gods existed at all, not how to live a successful life, but what success truly meant, what goodness was, what justice required, what reality itself consisted of. These questions seem almost unbearably large, the kind of inquiries that could consume a lifetime. And, indeed, they did, generation after generation of brilliant minds returning to the same fundamental puzzles, refining them, expanding them, building elaborate systems of thought that still echo in every philosophy classroom, every ethics debate, every moment when someone pauses and wonders about the nature of truth. I imagine the air itself in those days, dry and warm, carrying the scent of thyme and rosemary from the hillsides, the salt tang of the Aegean, the smell of olive oil and wine and bread, and underneath it all, the particular atmosphere of concentrated thought, of minds engaged in the most demanding work humans can undertake, the work of thinking clearly, of questioning assumptions, of following logic wherever it might lead. The philosophers walked these streets and paths, some wealthy and well-connected, others poor and peculiar, some surrounded by eager students, others wandering alone, but all united by this strange compulsion to understand, to examine, to question everything that others simply accepted. They gathered in gymnasiums and gardens, in porticos and private homes, wherever there was space to sit and talk, to think aloud, to test ideas against the sharp edges of dialectic, that method of question and answer, of proposal and counter-proposal, of slowly building toward truth through conversation. I can almost hear the rhythm of those dialogues, the back and forth, the moment when someone raises an objection, the pause as the other considers, the new formulation that emerges, slightly different, more precise, closer to something essential, This world of ancient Greek philosophy spans centuries, from the earliest pre-Socratic thinkers who looked at the natural world and wondered about its fundamental substance, through the golden age of classical Athens, and forward into the Hellenistic period when Greek thought spread across the Mediterranean and beyond, influencing every culture it touched. And throughout all those years, through all those different schools and systems and approaches, there runs a common thread: the belief that human reason could penetrate the mysteries of existence, that careful thought and honest inquiry could lead to genuine understanding, that wisdom was attainable if one was willing to dedicate oneself entirely to its pursuit. So I begin, as I see here, in this luminous space between history and imagination, ready to walk among these ancient thinkers, to visit their schools and their debates, to trace the evolution of their ideas, to see how questions asked more than 2,000 years ago continue to shape the way we think about everything that matters. The columns stand in rows, their shadows lengthening across marble and stone, and somewhere in the distance, the murmur of voices engaged in eternal conversation. The story begins on the edges, in the coastal cities of Ionia, where Greek-speaking colonists had established prosperous settlements along what is now the western coast of Turkey. Places like Miletus and Ephesus, cities that looked outward toward the sea, toward trade routes and foreign ideas, toward Egypt and Babylon and Persia. It was here, in the 6th century before the Common Era, that something remarkable began to happen, a new way of thinking about the world, one that would break away from purely mythological explanations and seek instead natural causes, rational principles, underlying patterns that could be discovered through observation and thought. The earliest of these thinkers is Thales of Miletus, a man who lived around 600 years before the Common Era, a merchant and mathematician who traveled widely, who predicted a solar eclipse, who measured the height of pyramids by their shadows, and who asked a question that seems simple but was revolutionary: what is everything made of? Before Thales, the answer would have involved gods and creation myths, stories of divine beings shaping the world from chaos. But Thales proposed something different. He suggested that all things, despite their apparent diversity, arose from a single substance, and he believed that substance was water. Water, which flows and freezes and evaporates, which takes countless forms, which is essential to all living things, which covers most of the earth. Perhaps water was the fundamental reality, and everything else merely transformations of this one primal element. We might smile at this conclusion now, but the question itself was extraordinary. The idea that beneath the multiplicity of appearances there might be a unity, a single principle from which everything derived. This was the beginning of philosophy, the attempt to find rational explanations for the nature of reality. Thales had students and successors, other thinkers in Miletus who took up his project but proposed different answers. Anaximander, who lived just after Thales, suggested that the fundamental substance was not water, but something he called the apeiron, the boundless or indefinite, something infinite and undefined from which all determinate things emerged. Anaximander created one of the first models of the cosmos, imagining the earth as a cylinder floating in space, surrounded by wheels of fire, glimpsed through openings that appeared as sun and moon and stars. He thought about how life might have originated, suggesting that humans must have descended from fish, an astonishing intuition of evolutionary thinking thousands of years before Darwin. Then came Anaximenes, the third great Milesian thinker, who proposed that air was the fundamental substance, air which could be rarefied into fire or condensed into wind and cloud and water and finally earth, a theory that tried to explain how the one could become the many through processes of expansion and compression. These Milesian philosophers, these first hesitant steps toward rational inquiry, were attempting something humans had never quite done before. They were trying to understand the world without appealing to divine intervention, to find natural explanations, to discover principles that operated consistently and could be understood through reason. And while they disagreed about the answers, the very fact that they were asking these questions, that they were proposing theories and debating them, created a new intellectual culture, one where ideas were tested against observation and logic rather than simply accepted on authority. Further south, on the island of Samos, and later in the Greek colonies of southern Italy, another kind of inquiry was developing. Here Pythagoras founded not just a school of thought, but something like a religious community, a brotherhood dedicated to the study of mathematics and music, bound by strict rules and secret teachings. Pythagoras, who may have lived from around 570 to 490 before the Common Era, believed that number was the fundamental reality, that mathematical relationships governed everything from the movements of celestial bodies to the harmonies of musical strings, that the cosmos itself was ordered according to numerical principles. The Pythagoreans discovered the mathematical ratios that produce harmonious musical intervals. They explored the properties of triangles and developed geometric proofs. They believed in the transmigration of souls, in reincarnation, and they lived according to various prohibitions and practices that seem mysterious to us now, avoiding beans, maintaining periods of silence, studying the properties of sacred shapes. For them, mathematics was not merely a tool, but a window into ultimate truth. Numbers revealed the hidden structure of reality, and through understanding numerical relationships, one could achieve not just knowledge, but purification, a spiritual ascent. Pythagoras left no writings, and much of what we know about him is entangled with legend, but his influence spread through southern Italy and Sicily, creating a tradition of mathematical mysticism that would profoundly shape later philosophy, especially Plato's belief in eternal forms and mathematical ideals. Meanwhile, in Ephesus, a city known for its great temple to Artemis, there lived a philosopher of an entirely different temperament, Heraclitus, who wrote in paradoxes and riddles, who was known as the Obscure One, the dark philosopher, because his sayings were so cryptic and challenging. Heraclitus, who flourished around 500 before the Common Era, saw reality as fundamentally characterized by change and conflict. Everything flows, he said. You cannot step twice into the same river, for fresh waters are ever flowing in upon you. The universe for Heraclitus was not static but dynamic, composed of opposites in tension, hot and cold, wet and dry, life and death, and it was precisely this tension, this strife between opposites, that generated everything. War is the father of all things, he proclaimed, not celebrating violence, but recognizing that existence itself arose from opposition and change. Yet beneath all of this flux, Heraclitus believed there was a logos, a rational principle, a kind of cosmic reason that governed the patterns of change. the way fire transforms wood into smoke and ash, the way day gives way to night and night to day, these transformations followed a hidden harmony, an order that most people failed to perceive. Fire was Heraclitus' symbol for this ever-living process. Fire that consumes and transforms, that is never the same from moment to moment, yet maintains its character as fire, an image of unity in multiplicity, permanence in change. His philosophy was challenging, even disturbing, because it denied the solidity of things. It suggested that what we take to be stable and enduring is actually in constant flux. That identity itself is a kind of illusion, or at least something far more complex than it appears. In stark contrast, in the Greek colonies of southern Italy, Parmenides of Elea proposed a philosophy that denied change entirely. He argued through a long and difficult poem that true being must be eternal, unchanging, indivisible, complete. Parmenides, who lived in the early 5th century before the Common Era, used rigorous logical argument to demonstrate that change and multiplicity were impossible, that they violated the basic principles of thought. Whatever is, and whatever is not, and there is no middle ground, no becoming, no coming to be or passing away. The world of change and diversity that we perceive through our senses, according to Parmenides, is an illusion, the way of seeming rather than the way of truth. Reality is one eternal, unchanging, and any philosophy that took change seriously was fundamentally mistaken. This was an audacious claim, and it created a profound problem for all subsequent philosophy. How could one account for the evident fact of change while respecting Parmenides' logical arguments? How could multiplicity be real if being was truly one? Parmenides had a brilliant student named Zeno, who defended his teacher's philosophy by developing a series of paradoxes designed to show that motion and change led to logical contradictions. The famous paradox of Achilles and the tortoise, the paradox of the arrow. Arguments so clever and troubling that philosophers would grapple with them for centuries. These early thinkers, scattered across the Greek world from Ionia to Italy, were creating the fundamental questions and problems that would occupy philosophy for its entire history. What is reality made of? Is it one or many? Does it change or remain eternally the same? Can we trust our senses or only our reason? What is the relationship between appearance and reality? And then, in the mid-5th century before the Common Era, the focus shifted. Athens, which had emerged as the greatest power in Greece after the Persian Wars, became the center of intellectual life, drawing thinkers from across the Greek world. Into this vibrant city came the Sophists, professional teachers who traveled from city to city, offering instruction in rhetoric, persuasion, the arts of successful public speaking, essential skills in a democracy where political life depended on one's ability to argue effectively in the assembly and the courts. The Sophists were controversial figures. Some of them, like Protagoras, were serious intellectuals who thought deeply about ethics and epistemology. Protagoras declared that man is the measure of all things, suggesting a kind of relativism, that truth and value were human constructs, dependent on individual or cultural perspective. Others, like Gorgias, dazzled audiences with displays of rhetorical virtuosity, arguing brilliantly on any side of any question, demonstrating that persuasion was an art independent of truth. That language could be used to make the weaker argument appear stronger. This emphasis on rhetoric and persuasion, on winning arguments rather than discovering truth, troubled many Athenians. It seemed to undermine traditional values, to suggest that justice and virtue were merely matters of convention, that there was no objective right and wrong, only clever manipulation of opinion. And it was against this backdrop, in response to both the natural philosophers who studied the cosmos and the sophists who studied human affairs, that the most famous period of Greek philosophy would emerge, centered on three extraordinary figures, Socrates, Plato, and Aristotle, who would transform philosophy from scattered inquiry into systematic discipline. But before we reach them, we must linger here a moment longer in this earlier world of bold speculation and radical questioning, where philosophy was still young, still finding its methods, still discovering what questions mattered most. The sun continues its arc across that ancient sky. The shadows lengthen and shift, and the conversations continue. Voices rising and falling, questions multiplying, the great adventure of human thought gathering momentum. The streets of Athens in the late 5th century before the Common Era were narrow and winding, crowded with merchants and craftsmen, with citizens arguing politics and foreigners seeking fortune, the air thick with dust and noise and the particular energy of a city at the height of its power. And somewhere in that bustle, moving through the agora, stopping to talk with anyone who would engage him, was a peculiar figure, barefoot and snub-nosed, with a pot-belly and a face like a satyr, a man who claimed to know nothing, who spent his days asking questions, who would become the most influential philosopher who ever lived, despite never writing a single word. Socrates, born around 470 before the Common Era, was the son of a stonemason and a midwife, and he would describe his own method as a kind of midwifery, helping others give birth to ideas that were already within them. Drawing out knowledge through careful questioning, he would approach someone in the marketplace, often someone with a reputation for wisdom or expertise, and ask them to define some concept they claimed to understand. What is courage? What is justice? What is piety? What is knowledge itself? And the person would offer a definition, confident at first, but Socrates would probe gently, asking for clarification, proposing counterexamples, showing contradictions, and gradually the definition would unravel, revealing that what seemed clear and certain was actually confused and uncertain. This became known as the Socratic method, this relentless questioning, this refusal to accept easy answers, and it made Socrates both beloved and hated, beloved by young men who followed him around the city, delighted to watch him deflate the pretensions of their elders, hated by those same elders who found themselves publicly humiliated, exposed as not knowing what they claimed to know. But Socrates insisted he was performing a service. The unexamined life is not worth living, he proclaimed, and most people lived unexamined lives, accepting conventional beliefs without question, confusing opinion with knowledge, never bothering to think carefully about the most important matters, how to live, what to value, what it meant to be good. He had a divine mission, he said, given to him by the oracle at Delphi. The priestess there had declared that no one was wiser than Socrates, and he had set out to prove the oracle wrong, searching for someone genuinely wise. only to discover that while others thought they knew things they did not know, he at least knew that he knew nothing, and this awareness of his own ignorance was a kind of wisdom. Socrates fought in the Peloponnesian War, the long, devastating conflict between Athens and Sparta. He served with distinction as a hoplite soldier, showing physical courage, but his greater courage was intellectual and moral. His willingness to follow argument wherever it led, to stand up to political pressure, to remain true to his principles even when it cost him everything. He believed that virtue was knowledge, that no one did wrong willingly, that if you truly understood what was good, you would inevitably do it. This seemed paradoxical, but Socrates argued that when people acted badly, it was always because they were confused, mistaking what merely seemed good for what truly was good, chasing pleasure or wealth or power while losing sight of the genuine well-being of their souls. The soul, psyche in Greek, was Socrates' great concern, and not the body with its appetites and vulnerabilities, but the inner self, the rational and moral core of a person. And caring for the soul meant pursuing wisdom and virtue, meant examining oneself constantly, meant valuing truth over reputation, justice over success. His conversations often ended in aporia, a state of puzzlement, with no clear answer reached, but this was not failure, it was progress. Better to recognize one's ignorance than to remain trapped in false certainty. Better to keep questioning than to accept comfortable delusions. For decades, Socrates wandered Athens asking his questions, never charging fees like the sophists, living in poverty, wearing the same worn cloak year-round, subsisting on simple food, his needs minimal, because his focus was entirely on the life of the mind, on philosophy as a way of being rather than merely a subject to study. But Athens was changing. The long war with Sparta had ended in humiliating defeat. Democracy had been briefly overthrown by oligarchy, then restored. The city was traumatized and angry, looking for someone to blame. And Socrates, with his constant questioning, his association with men who had betrayed Athens, his habit of making prominent citizens look foolish, became a target. In 399 before the Common Era, when Socrates was 70 years old, he was brought to trial, charged with impiety, with failing to recognize the gods of the city and introducing new divinities, and with corrupting the youth, teaching them to question authority and tradition. The trial took place before a jury of 500 Athenian citizens, and Socrates defended himself, not by appealing to pity or making compromises, but by reaffirming everything he had always stood for. He would not stop philosophizing. He would not abandon his divine mission. He would rather die than live without examining life and pursuing truth. The jury found him guilty by a narrow margin, and according to Athenian law, both prosecution and defense could propose a penalty. The prosecution proposed death, and Socrates, in what might have been irony or genuine conviction, suggested that instead of punishment, he deserved to be maintained at public expense in the Prytaneum, the honor given to Olympic victors, because he had spent his life benefiting the city through philosophy. The jury was not amused and voted for death by an even larger margin. Socrates would drink hemlock, a poison that would gradually paralyze his body until it stopped his breathing and his heart. He spent his final days in prison, surrounded by friends and students, continuing to do what he had always done, talking about philosophy examining questions about death and immortality and the nature of the soul, remaining cheerful and unafraid, insisting that a good person cannot be harmed, that nothing bad can happen to someone who has lived virtuously. On the day of his execution, he bathed and said farewell to his family, then drank the hemlock calmly, walking around until his legs grew heavy, then lying down as the numbness spread upward through his body. His final words were to remind his friend Crito that they owed a rooster to Asclepius, the god of healing, perhaps suggesting that death was a cure, a release of the soul from the body. And with Socrates' death, philosophy became something more than scattered inquiry. It became a way of life demanding total commitment, a calling that might require the ultimate sacrifice, and it inspired one of his devoted followers to ensure that Socrates' voice would never be silenced. That follower was Plato, born into an aristocratic Athenian family around 427 before the Common Era, a young man who might have pursued politics or poetry, but who encountered Socrates and devoted his life to philosophy instead. Plato was devastated by his teacher's execution. He left Athens for a time, traveling to Italy and Sicily, studying with the Pythagoreans, learning mathematics and geometry, absorbing their belief that abstract mathematical forms represented a higher reality than the physical world of flux and change. When he returned to Athens, around 387 before the Common Era, Plato founded a school in a grove sacred to the hero Academus, the Academy, which would continue for nearly 900 years, becoming the model for all later universities, a place dedicated entirely to the pursuit of knowledge through dialogue and inquiry. And Plato began to write, creating a series of dialogues, philosophical dramas, in which Socrates appeared as the main character, questioning and probing and examining. These dialogues preserved not just Socrates' method, but something of his personality, his irony and humor, his ability to puncture pretension, his relentless pursuit of truth. The early dialogues likely represent the historical Socrates fairly closely. Works like the Euthyphro, where Socrates questions a religious expert about the nature of piety, or the Apology, which presents Socrates' defense speech at his trial, or the Crito, where he explains why he will not escape from prison even when given the chance. But gradually, the dialogues became vehicles for Plato's own philosophy. Socrates, the character, began expressing views that went far beyond anything the historical Socrates likely believed. And Plato developed a comprehensive system that addressed not just ethics, but metaphysics, epistemology, politics, aesthetics, cosmology. At the heart of Plato's philosophy was the theory of forms, the idea that the physical world we perceive through our senses is not the most real world, that it is actually a kind of shadow or reflection of a higher realm of perfect eternal forms or ideas. Consider a circle drawn in the sand. It is never perfectly round. It has thickness and irregularity. It will be washed away by the tide. But the form of circle, the pure mathematical ideal, is eternal and perfect. It exists not in space and time, but in a transcendent realm accessible only to thought. And this was true not just of mathematical objects, but of everything. There was a form of beauty itself, of justice itself, of the good itself, and particular beautiful things, or just actions participated in or imitated these eternal forms. They were beautiful, or just to the extent that they resembled the perfect, unchanging archetypes. This solved the problem posed by Heraclitus and Parmenides. The physical world could change and flux just as Heraclitus said, but the forms were eternal and unchanging, just as Parmenides insisted. And true knowledge was not of the changing physical world, but of the unchanging forms. Plato illustrated this with his famous allegory of the cave. Imagine prisoners chained in a cave from childhood, facing a wall. Behind them a fire burns, and between the fire and the prisoners, people carry objects that cast shadows on the wall. The prisoners see only these shadows and take them for reality. But if a prisoner were freed and turned around, he would see the fire and the objects themselves and realize the shadows were mere reflections. And if he were dragged out of the cave into the sunlight, he would at first be blinded, but gradually his eyes would adjust, and he would see the real world, trees and mountains, and finally the sun itself, the source of all light and life. This, Plato said, was the journey of the philosopher, from the shadows of opinion and sense perception, up through mathematics and dialectic, to direct apprehension of the forms, and ultimately to knowledge of the form of the good, which illuminated all other knowledge just as the sun illuminated the physical world. Education then was not putting knowledge into empty minds, but turning the soul around, redirecting it from the shadows toward reality. And those who made this journey, the philosophers, were the only ones fit to rule, because only they understood what was truly good, what policies would create genuine justice and happiness rather than merely appearing to do so. In the Republic, Plato's longest and most influential dialogue, he designed an ideal city ruled by philosopher kings, where children were raised communally, where private property was abolished for the ruling class, where poets were banished for telling lies about the gods, a utopia that many readers find simultaneously inspiring and totalitarian. But Plato was not just theorizing. He tried 3 times to put his ideas into practice in Syracuse, a Greek city in Sicily, attempting to educate the young tyrant Dionysius the Younger, to turn him into a philosopher king, and 3 times it ended in failure and danger, Plato barely escaping with his life. Still, back in Athens, the academy flourished. Students came from across the Greek world, and among them, arriving at age 17 or 18, was a young man from Stagira in northern Greece, the son of a physician, brilliant and ambitious and destined to become even more influential than his teacher. His name was Aristotle, and he would study at the academy for 20 years, until Plato's death, absorbing everything, questioning everything, and eventually developing a philosophy that departed from Plato's in fundamental ways, bringing philosophy down from the transcendent realm of forms and back to the physical world of nature and change. Aristotle was born in 384 before the Common Era in Stagira, a small town on the northern coast of the Aegean, far from the cultural center of Athens. His father Nicomachus was court physician to the king of Macedon, and this connection would shape Aristotle's life in unexpected ways. When he arrived at Plato's academy as a teenager, Aristotle was brilliant but also stubborn, willing to challenge his teacher. Plato supposedly called him the foal because, like a young horse, he was always kicking against the very one who nourished him. But this intellectual independence was precisely what would make Aristotle great. For 20 years he studied and taught at the academy, absorbing Plato's philosophy while developing doubts about it. And when Plato died in 347 before the Common Era, Aristotle left Athens, perhaps disappointed at not being chosen to lead the academy, perhaps simply ready to pursue his own path. He traveled to Asia Minor, to the island of Lesbos, studying marine biology, collecting specimens, examining the structure and behavior of sea creatures with meticulous care, and this empirical investigation of nature, this attention to particular facts and details, would become central to his philosophical method. Then came an extraordinary opportunity. Philip of Macedon, the king who was transforming his backward kingdom into a military superpower, invited Aristotle to tutor his 13-year-old son, Alexander. And for several years, Aristotle taught the boy who would become Alexander the Great, instructing him in Homer and Greek literature, in ethics and politics, though what influence this philosophical education had on Alexander's later career of conquest remains unclear. When Alexander ascended to the throne and began his campaigns, Aristotle returned to Athens, now in his 50s, and founded his own school, the Lyceum, named for the grove of Apollolykios, where it was located. Here he would walk along covered walkways while lecturing, and his followers became known as the Peripatetics, the walkers, at the Lyceum. Aristotle created something unprecedented. A research institution, he and his students collected information on an astonishing range of subjects. The constitutions of 158 Greek city-states, biological observations of hundreds of animal species, astronomical data, ethical case studies, literary analysis. They were attempting nothing less than to organize and understand all human knowledge. And Aristotle wrote, "Though what we have are not polished dialogues like Plato's, but lecture notes, treatises, working documents full of technical terminology and careful distinctions, texts that were studied and commented on for 2,000 years, that would dominate medieval philosophy and shape the development of science, where Plato had looked to an eternal realm of forms beyond the physical world." Aristotle insisted that the forms were in the things themselves, embedded in matter. There was no separate form of tree, but rather the form or essence of treeness existed in each individual tree, making it what it was, everything in nature. Aristotle argued had four causes: the material cause, what it was made of; the formal cause, what made it the kind of thing it was; the efficient cause, what brought it into being; and the final cause, what purpose or goal it served. And understanding anything meant grasping all four causes. This teleological view, this idea that natural things had inherent purposes, shaped his entire philosophy. An acorn had the potential to become an oak, and it actualized that potential by growing. Change was not random flux, but development toward natural ends, everything striving to fulfill its nature. For human beings, the key question was what our natural end or function was. And Aristotle's answer was eudaimonia, often translated as happiness, but really meaning flourishing or living well, the full realization of human potential. And this came through virtue, through excellent functioning according to reason, which was the distinctive human capacity. Virtue itself was not knowledge, as Socrates had claimed, but habit. We become virtuous by practicing virtuous actions, by finding the mean between extremes. Courage was the mean between cowardice and recklessness, generosity between stinginess and wastefulness. And this required practical wisdom, phronesis, the ability to perceive what action a situation called for. The highest human activity, Aristotle believed, was contemplation, theoretical study pursued for its own sake. This most resembled the activity of God, the unmoved mover who thought only about thinking, who set the cosmos in motion not through active intervention, but by being the object of love and desire toward which all things moved. In politics, Aristotle rejected Plato's ideal republic. He studied actual constitutions, analyzed what worked and what failed, concluded that the best realistic government was a mixed constitution balancing elements of monarchy, aristocracy, and democracy, with a large middle class providing stability, and he defended private property and the family against Plato's communalism. His influence was immediate and enduring. The Lyceum became a center of research and learning. But Aristotle's life ended in shadow. When Alexander died suddenly in 323 before the Common Era, anti-Macedonian sentiments swept Athens, and Aristotle, associated with the Macedonian court, was charged with impiety, the same charge that had killed Socrates. He fled to Chalcis, saying he would not allow Athens to sin twice against philosophy, and died there a year later, at 62, from a digestive illness. His will carefully provided for his household, freed his slaves, and arranged for his daughter's marriage, the practical concerns of a man who believed in living well in this world. After Aristotle, philosophy entered a new phase, the Hellenistic period, as Alexander's conquest spread Greek culture across the Mediterranean and into Asia, creating a cosmopolitan world where the old city-state loyalties seemed parochial, where individuals felt adrift in vast kingdoms, where the urgent question was not how to be a good citizen, but how to achieve personal tranquility in uncertain times. New schools emerged. Epicurus founded a garden school in Athens around 300 before the Common Era, teaching that pleasure was the highest good, though by pleasure he meant not wild indulgence, but the absence of pain and disturbance, ataraxia, tranquility, achieved through simple living, friendship, and the study of philosophy. The Epicureans believed the gods existed but did not intervene in human affairs, that the soul was material and dissolved at death, that there was therefore nothing to fear, no divine punishment, no afterlife, just the finite span of life to be lived as pleasantly and peacefully as possible. And this required overcoming irrational fears and unnecessary desires. Meanwhile, Zeno of Citium, who had come to Athens as a merchant and stayed to study philosophy, founded the Stoic school around the same time, teaching in the Stoa Poikile, the painted colonnade from which his followers took their name. The Stoics believed in living according to nature, accepting whatever happened as the working of divine providence, a rational cosmic order that determined all events. Human freedom consisted not in controlling external circumstances, which was impossible, but in controlling one's own judgments and responses. Virtue alone was sufficient for happiness. The Stoics insisted everything else, health, wealth, reputation, family, were merely preferred indifference, nice to have, but ultimately irrelevant to true well-being. What mattered was maintaining proper judgment, not being disturbed by misfortune, accepting one's fate with equanimity. This philosophy would prove enormously influential, spreading throughout the Roman world. adopted by slaves like Epictetus and emperors like Marcus Aurelius, providing consolation and strength through times of persecution and chaos, teaching that inner freedom was inviolable even when outer freedom was lost. A third Hellenistic school, the skeptics, took uncertainty itself as their theme, arguing that for every argument there was an equally strong counter-argument, that we should suspend judgment on all matters, achieving ataraxia through the recognition that nothing could be known for certain. They were descendants of Socrates, in a way, taking his profession of ignorance to its logical extreme. These Hellenistic philosophies were less systematic than Plato and Aristotle, more focused on practical ethics than metaphysics. They offered not grand theories of reality, but recipes for living, techniques for achieving peace of mind, and they attracted followers across the Mediterranean world, adapting to different cultures, blending with local traditions. Greek philosophy also encountered other traditions. In Alexandria, the great library and museum became centers of learning where Greek thought mixed with Egyptian and Jewish ideas. Philo of Alexandria, a Jewish philosopher in the 1st century of the Common Era, tried to reconcile Plato with Scripture, reading the Hebrew Bible allegorically, finding Greek metaphysics in the book of Genesis, and as Rome absorbed the Greek world politically, it absorbed Greek philosophy intellectually. Educated Romans studied in Athens, read Plato and Aristotle, adopted Stoicism as particularly suited to their martial temperament. Cicero translated philosophical terms into Latin, making Greek thought accessible to a new audience. The final great ancient philosopher was Plotinus, who lived in the 3rd century of the Common Era in a Roman Empire besieged by barbarians and racked by crisis. He developed Neoplatonism, a mystical interpretation of Plato that saw reality as emanating from the One, an ineffable source beyond being, flowing down through levels of decreasing unity and reality, nous or intellect, psyche or soul, and finally matter. The goal of philosophy for Plotinus was kenosis, union with the One, achieved through contemplation and ascetic practice, turning away from the material world, ascending through the levels of reality until the soul merged with its source, and Plotinus claimed to have achieved this mystical union several times in his life. His student Porphyry collected his writings into the Enneads, and this late flowering of Greek philosophy would profoundly influence early Christian theology, providing concepts and vocabulary for articulating the relationship between God and creation, between the divine and human natures of Christ, between time and eternity. When the Emperor Justinian closed the philosophical schools of Athens in 529 of the Common Era, including Plato's Academy, which had survived for 900 years, it marked the end of ancient philosophy as a living tradition, but not the end of its influence, which had already spread far beyond Greece, into Christian Europe, into the Islamic world, into every culture that encountered the texts and questions these ancient thinkers had left behind. The voices have grown quieter now. The colonnades stand empty. The gardens where Epicurus taught are long overgrown, but the questions remain, hovering in the air like late afternoon light, questions about the nature of reality and the meaning of virtue, about how to live and what to value, about the relationship between knowledge and happiness, between reason and faith, between the individual and society. These ancient philosophers, with their simple robes and their endless conversations, created something that would never die, not a set of fixed doctrines, but a way of thinking, a commitment to following arguments wherever they led, to examining life rather than simply living it, to seeking wisdom even knowing it might forever elude our grasp. And so we find ourselves standing in this quiet space between antiquity and imagination, where the distant past feels strangely present, where questions asked more than 2 millennia ago still echo with unsettling relevance. What did these philosophers give us? These men who walked dusty paths and argued in marketplaces, who chose poverty and inquiry over comfort and certainty, who believed that thinking carefully about existence was the most important thing a human being could do. They gave us, first of all, the very idea that reality might be understood through reason, that beneath the chaos of appearances there might be order, patterns, principles discoverable through careful thought. This was not obvious. Most human cultures had explained the world through myth and tradition, through stories of gods and heroes, through received wisdom never meant to be questioned. But the Greeks dared to question, to propose natural explanations, to test ideas against logic and observation, and in doing so they created science, philosophy, critical thinking itself, the foundation of every intellectual discipline that followed. They gave us ethics as systematic inquiry. Before Socrates, people knew how to act. They followed customs and conventions. They honored the gods and obeyed their parents. But they did not ask why, did not examine the principles underlying right action, did not wonder whether conventional morality might be mistaken. Socrates made ethics philosophical, turned it into a subject requiring careful analysis, and his successors developed competing theories: virtue ethics focusing on character, Stoic ethics emphasizing acceptance, Epicurean ethics pursuing tranquility, each offering a different vision of human flourishing, each still debated today in slightly different vocabulary, but essentially unchanged questions. They gave us political philosophy, the attempt to think rationally about justice, about what made governments legitimate, about the relationship between individual freedom and collective welfare. Plato's Republic and Aristotle's Politics established frameworks that every subsequent political thinker would either build upon or react against. The idea that rulers should be wise rather than merely powerful, that laws should serve justice rather than simply express the will of the strong, that political arrangements could be evaluated and improved through reason. These were revolutionary concepts, and they planted seeds that would eventually grow into democracy, human rights, constitutional government. They gave us logic, the formal study of correct reasoning. Aristotle systematized the syllogism, analyzed fallacies, created tools for distinguishing valid from invalid arguments, and later Greek logicians like Chrysippus developed propositional logic, the foundation of mathematics and computer science, ways of thinking that would prove essential to every form of rigorous inquiry. They gave us wonder, that peculiar state of mind where curiosity overwhelms certainty, where questions become more valuable than answers. Aristotle said that philosophy begins in wonder, and the best Greek philosophers maintained that sense of astonishment throughout their lives, never lost the capacity to be amazed by existence, by the fact that there is something rather than nothing, that the cosmos is ordered rather than chaotic, that consciousness emerged from matter and can contemplate its own origins. This wonder was not mystical but rational, not passive but active. It demanded investigation, explanation, understanding, yet it also recognized limits, knew that some mysteries might prove impenetrable, that human reason, powerful as it was, might never grasp ultimate reality. And this combination of confidence and humility, of ambition and modesty, characterized the best Greek philosophy. They gave us models of philosophical lives, Socrates facing death with courage, Diogenes living in a barrel and mocking convention, Epicurus cultivating friendship in his garden, Epictetus maintaining dignity in slavery, Marcus Aurelius seeking wisdom on the battlefield. These were not just thinkers, but exemplars, showing that philosophy was not academic abstraction, but a way of being in the world. The philosophical life required sacrifice. It meant valuing truth over popularity, wisdom over wealth, integrity over success. It meant accepting that most people would not understand, that you might be mocked or persecuted, that you might die for your principles as Socrates did, yet it offered something invaluable in return: the examined life, the life lived consciously, with awareness and purpose, and perhaps most profoundly, they gave us ourselves, or at least a particular understanding of what it meant to be human. The Greek philosophers invented the concept of the autonomous, rational individual, the self-capable of questioning tradition, of making independent judgments, of taking responsibility for its own beliefs and actions. Before Greek philosophy, identity was primarily collective. You were a member of a tribe, a family, a city. Your role was defined by tradition and maintained through ritual. But Socrates insisted that each person must think for themselves, must examine their own lives, must take ownership of their souls. This emphasis on individual rationality and moral autonomy would become foundational to Western culture. For better and worse, it enabled scientific progress in human rights, but also alienation and rootlessness. It freed individuals from oppressive traditions, but also cut them off from sources of meaning and belonging. The Greek legacy is therefore complex, not simply a gift, but a challenge, an invitation to think, to question, to seek wisdom, but also a warning about the costs of such seeking, about how philosophical inquiry can destabilize certainties, can leave us uncertain and anxious, can reveal problems we cannot solve. Yet perhaps this uncertainty is itself valuable. Perhaps the questions matter more than the answers. Perhaps philosophy's greatest contribution is not any particular doctrine or system, but the practice itself, the ongoing conversation, the willingness to keep thinking, to keep examining, to never settle into dogmatic slumber. The light has grown softer now, that golden afternoon light deepening toward evening, the shadows stretching long across ancient stones. And in this gentle dimming there is something peaceful, something like acceptance. We cannot return to Athens in its glory, cannot sit at Socrates' feet or walk with Aristotle, cannot join the philosophical schools or debate in the agora. That world is gone, lost to time as completely as the sound of their voices, the texture of their actual daily lives. What remains are texts, fragments, commentaries upon commentaries, words preserved through centuries of copying and translation, sometimes distorted, sometimes clarified, always at a remove from the living thought that first produced them. And yet, when we read Plato's dialogues or Aristotle's treatises, When we encounter Socrates questioning, Epicurus counseling, Marcus Aurelius reflecting, something comes alive. Not the historical reality, perhaps, but something equally real. A meeting of minds across time, a conversation that death cannot end. The questions they asked are our questions still. What is justice? What is happiness? How should we live? What can we know? What is real? These are not ancient puzzles, but perennial human concerns, and their attempts at answers, however flawed or incomplete, still illuminate our own groping toward understanding. Philosophy continues in universities and coffee shops, in solitary thought and public debate, building on what the Greeks began, using their methods, refining their arguments, sometimes rejecting their conclusions, but always indebted to their example, to their audacious belief that human reason could make sense of existence. The stars are beginning to appear, one by one, in the deepening blue above, the same stars the Greeks saw, though they understood them differently, thought them fixed in crystalline spheres, divine and eternal. We know now they are distant suns, some already dead, their light still traveling toward us across impossible distances. But that difference in understanding does not diminish the wonder, does not make the stars less beautiful. And perhaps Greek philosophy is like that, its specific doctrines superseded, its cosmology outdated, its science primitive, yet its essential achievement untouched, the achievement of thinking, of questioning, of refusing to accept ignorance as fate. The air grows cool, the way it does as daylight fades, and there is something in this cooling, this gentle transition from light to darkness, that feels appropriate, like a natural conclusion, not an ending, but a passing, a giving way. The philosophers are gone, their voices silent, their footsteps no longer echo on marble, but what they made. This thing called philosophy, this practice of careful thinking, continues, changes, adapts, remains always vital, always necessary. And in some sense they are not gone. Not entirely, for whenever someone stops to think clearly about existence, to question assumptions, to examine life rather than simply living it, Socrates is there, Plato is there, Aristotle is there, all of them present in the act of philosophical inquiry itself. The last light lingers on the hilltops, reluctant to go, painting everything in shades of amber and rose. And then softly, gradually, it fades, leaving the world to darkness and to stars, to the quiet that comes after speaking, to the peace that follows questions, when we accept that some answers must wait, perhaps forever. Perhaps that too is wisdom, knowing when to rest, when to let go, when to simply be, here, now, in this moment of fading light, this threshold between day and night, between knowing and unknowing, between the voice and the silence that follows.